Chapter 5:12. The sky was illuminated by the dazzling lightning, which made it unclear. It was the first time for Fan Zisong to see such a magical scene. Looking at the lush trees flashing with lightning all over the mountain, he was full of novelty. Immortal Mi Shin showed a faint smile, as if he saw himself in those years, but the master who took him to Mount Fenglei had already passed away. Let's walk slowly. The lightning in Mount Fenglei is relatively mild. It can refine your body and improve your strength, which is rare for practitioners. Immortal Mi Shin reminded, and Fan Zisong immediately slowed down. He felt a slight numbness under his feet, and his whole body trembled slightly. Soon, a layer of fine sweat appeared, which was extremely comfortable. However, he could feel that the tempering effect of the lightning here was far less than the lightning he had encountered during the lightning pool competition. Over the past 3 days, besides healing his injuries, he also discovered that his aptitude and the strength of his body had increased by more than just a little. If there is a comparison, it is the gap between a firefly and a bright moon. Who on earth helped me that day? Fan Zisong couldn't figure it out, so he could only suppress his doubts in the bottom of his heart. Looking at the towering trees flashing with lightning arcs in the distance, a little tenderness flashed through his eyes. Master's situation is temporarily stabilized. Don't worry too much. When this thing is over, I can go back to Huajian sect to see my junior sister apprentices. I heard that Huajian sect has changed its name to Ni sect, and Immortal Hongyu is missing. I don't know how they are living. After reminding Fan Zisong, Immortal Mi Shin didn't pay attention to him anymore. He stared at the towering thunder trees in the distance, and his blood flowed slightly faster. After the death of his master, there was no practitioner in Zhongjian branch who had passed nature's test and gradually declined. Fengguang branch and Zhongjian branch were hostile to each other, so it was expected that they were forced. Therefore, his situation became more and more difficult. The only way that Immortal Mi Shin could think of to break the situation was Mount Fenglei. If I can get the recognition of the ancestral thunder and alarm the old ancestor to come out of practice to protect me, my Zhongjian branch can come back to life and regain the glory of the past. Immortal Mi Shin took a deep breath. This time, he got the only chance because of Fan Zisong's inexplicable victory. He must not fail. With their own thoughts, they went deep into Mount Fenglei. Under the cover of endless lightning, neither of them noticed that there were 2 figures not far behind them. Is this the holy place of your Leiyuan sect? Gui Lazy chuckled with slight disdain. It's even worse than the periphery of the holy land of my Fenglei sect. It seems that the old ancestor of your Leiyuan sect who left my sect was just an ordinary person. Kai Yu's face darkened slightly, but he smiled again in an instant. Leiyuan sect is small and can't rank in the top in Jiuzhou region. How can it compare with holy sects? Gui Lazy laughed and did not respond to Immortal Kai Yu, but he was quite happy in his heart. He said in a slightly relaxed tone, "Don't rush to take action. Let's follow them first. Maybe we can gain more." After refining the White Thunder mark with the secret method of the holy sect, he was extremely sensitive to thunder and lightning. He had already smelled another trace of the ancestral thunder. 2 kinds of ancestral thunder. Gui Lazy squinted. No one would complain about having too many ancestral thunder. Kai Yu nodded, but didn't think so much. He only hoped to kill Immortal Mi Shin and his disciple quickly and go to the holy sect to practice. He had a trump card in his hand, which was inherited from an evil old monster in his early years. It only took him a moment to kill Mi Shin. There was no accident. When the old ancestor of Leiyuan sect was alarmed to come out, he had already left Jiuzhou region and went to the holy sect. This was also the reason why he agreed to trade with Ghost Thunder. As Fan Zisong and Immortal Mi Shin went deeper, the intensity of thunder and lightning gradually increased. Even Immortal Mi Shin felt a sense of numbness, and his physical body was slightly improved. However, Fan Zisong didn't feel anything. His physical body had been improved to the limit in a short time. If he wanted to improve again, he needed to wait until his physical body was completely adapted. Seeing this, Immortal Mi Shin immediately sped up. In the second half of the journey, Fan Zisong's face was terribly pale. Finally, he couldn't hold it anymore. He crushed the thunder-isolating matrix in his hand, and the intensity of thunder and lightning dropped by 90%. Suddenly, he felt much better. Hold on for a while. When we get under the thunder tree, all the thunder and lightning will be isolated. Shin's voice came. Fan Zisong gasped and nodded with firm eyes. Although Senior Lee had determined that he couldn't get the mark of the ancestral thunder, he still had a fluke in his heart. About 15 minutes later, Fan Zisong and Shin finally came to the huge thunder tree they saw before. As Shin said, thunder and lightning were completely isolated by the shady green tree tower. The manic and tyrannical Numa faded away, and the fragrance of trees filled the surroundings, which was indescribably gentle. Fan Zisong took a deep breath and recovered a lot. He walked to the root of the huge tree whose top couldn't be seen. His eyes were full of amazement. For a moment, he felt that the human clan was so small. However, he didn't forget the business. He came to his sense soon and asked, "Master, what should we do?" Shin smiled, "I'll do it first. Pay attention to the details. Don't be distracted." Fan Zisong nodded, and then he saw Shin casually stamped on the circle of purple runes on the thick tree root. He said, "The ancestral thunder has a spirit. If you want to get its recognition, you must have a high qualification of thunder circle first. When I came here last time, I was still in Yuanying realm like you. This time, I stepped into Huashan realm with thunder circle." Speaking of this, Shin slowed down his breath. His eyes were focused and serious. He gently spat out his palm, and the blue lightning surged. In the blink of an eye, the whole runes were submerged. Fan Zisong couldn't help holding his breath. After dozens of breaths, the huge tree didn't change. Sure enough, Shin removed his palm with a bitter smile and shook his head. "Even if my cultivation is improved, I can't attract the attention of the ancestral thunder without changing my qualification. Forget it. Zisong, you have a try." "Okay." Seeing his master stepped back, a glimmer of expectation flashed through Fan Zisong's eyes. He stepped forward and stamped on the runes with his palm. He tried to run the thunder circle of the heavy sword sect to his palm. Soon, the same blue lightning appeared in the nothingness. However, compared with immortal Shin's, the blue was much lighter and closer to sky blue. After a while, Fan Zisong frowned secretly. "There is no movement. Although I have the thunder spiritual root, it is only the 2nd grade. It's reasonable that the ancestral thunder doesn't like me." So, hesitation flashed through his eyes, and then it was soon replaced by a trace of decisiveness. He tried his best to search the few remaining mysterious lightning in his body and poured it into his palm. At the moment when the lightning poured into the runes, the whole huge tree shook violently. Boom! There is movement. Zisong, he. Immortal Shin knew Fan Zisong very well, so he didn't count on him. Now seeing this scene, he suddenly widened his eyes incredulously. Even the calm state of mind that he had cultivated for hundreds of years was broken. Fan Zisong was also excited. He tried to maintain the gesture and not let the violent shock affect him. However, his shadow suddenly moved and completely entered the runes along with the lightning he transmitted. In the pale green nothingness, a black light flashed, and Su Li appeared. She roughly looked at this blue nothingness, and a glimmer of interest flashed through her eyes. "Black Lotus, is there really divine thunder of wood here?" No response. Su Li glanced at her empty ring finger and sensed Black Lotus ring that had curled up to the deepest part of her body. She couldn't help but be speechless. She forgot that Black Lotus ring hated divine thunder most. "Who are you? Why do you come here?" Suddenly, a tender and doubtful voice came into her ears. Su Li's heart shrank, but the smile on her face remained unchanged. She turned around and saw a young boy who was unbelievably beautiful. The young man's skin was pure white, shining like white snow. His soft blue hair reached his waist, and his face was more delicate and pure than a woman's. Sensing the unusual movement of divine thunder of earth in her body, Su Li restored her true appearance and smiled more. "My name is Su Jojo." "What's your name?" The young man was stunned for a moment, and then he was disappointed and said, "I don't have a name." Although the spirit of divine thunder of wood had transformed, it was as pure as a piece of white paper. Su Li quickly guessed what was in front of her. She walked to the young man and waved her hand to show 2 soft chairs. She said in a gentle tone, "How about I give you one? In exchange, I will take you out to see the wonderful outside world." Seeing the soft chair, the young man touched it curiously, and then sat down like Su Li. However, because he didn't control a trace of the escaping thunder and fire, the soft chair was burned to ashes in a blink of an eye. The young man was stunned and saw that there was still a seat next to Su Li. He scratched his head and didn't understand the difference between intimacy and alienation. He sat directly next to Su Li and subconsciously sniffed Su Li's arm. "You have a pneuma that I like very much." Su Li was slightly stunned, and then a trace of yellow lightning escaped from her fingertips. "That's it." The young man stretched out his hand to grab it, and the 2 contrasting thunderbolts suddenly made a harsh crackling sound. The young man became more excited and looked at Su Li as if he saw his own relatives. "Are you my elder sister? I heard from people outside that those who feel close are all relatives." "Elder sister, give me a name." Su Li couldn't help laughing. Although she inexplicably had a younger brother with the spirit of thunder and lightning, it didn't prevent her from having a good impression of the young man who was like a piece of white paper. "Since you call me elder sister, you can follow my surname. How about Su Bai?" "Su Bai, Su Bai," the young man whispered and smiled, showing his canine teeth. "I like this name. It sounds much better than what those people call me." "Those people?" Su Li knew that he was talking about the people of Leyuan's sect, and immediately asked with a smile, "What do they call you?" "They call me Old Ancestor." The young man sniffed and said with extreme disgust. Su Li couldn't help but cover her mouth and chuckle. "Come with me. Staying here will only limit your growth." "Okay." The young man nodded without hesitation. He didn't know what refusal was, but soon he was worried again. "Elder sister, I haven't eaten enough for a long time. If I go out with you, will it make you hungry?" Su Li shook her head and laughed. She immediately touched the young man's soft hair, and her eyes were as soft as water. "What a good boy. There are so many thunder and lightning tests here that I can't finish them." Chapter 5:13. Under the giant tree of Mount Fenglei, the smell of blood pervaded. Fan Zisang looked at his master, who spat blood and fell to the ground. No one knew whether he was dead or alive. He was shocked and angry. Clap, clap, clap. Crisp applause accompanied Gui Lazy's arrival with a smile. "Immortal Kai Yu has such a magic weapon. It's really an eye-opener for me." Immortal Kai Yu withdrew his palm print. At this moment, his whole body was full of vigor and blood, and strange runes appeared around him from time to time. He looked at Fan Zisang expressionlessly, as if he was looking at a dead man, but his tone was flattering. "You flatter me, High Sect. I have to rely on High Sect when I enter holy sects in the future." As he said, he casually threw away the broken bloodstone in his hand. "Let's get what you want and leave immediately." After listening to their conversation, Fan Zisang connected with the common sense of holy sects that Senior Li told him, and immediately understood the reason. He knew that he couldn't escape, so he simply gave up. He looked ferocious and laughed. "I see. Gui Lazy, you are a spy of holy sects. You are just an exiled person of holy sects. How can you get the mark of ancestral thunder to turn over a new leaf? Don't even think about it." As he said, he was about to take down his hands that were printed on the runes. Gui Lazy's face changed slightly. With a gloomy expression, he shouted coldly, "Stop him." Immortal Kai Yu felt something was wrong, but he had already injured Mi Shin seriously. There was no turning back. Even if he realized that he was deceived by Gui Lazy, he had to continue. His figure flashed and he wanted to hold Fan Zisang's hand. But he was still one step late. Fan Zisang sneered and withdrew his hand slowly. The shaking giant tree suddenly calmed down. "How dare you!" Gui Lazy shouted angrily. He made a gesture in his hand, and a white lightning shot to the runes, but it hit nothing. All of a sudden, boom. When everyone was shocked, there was a loud bang on the ground. The giant tree as high as Yunchuan began to shrink rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared in a pocket cave. A petite figure with a delicate figure appeared in front of everyone. Fan Zisang stared at Su Li's face, which was as delicate as that year, blankly. Junior sister apprentice? Why would junior sister appear here? Could it be an illusion? Caillou and others were also stunned. Only Gooey Lazy had a flash of lightning in his mind. Suddenly, he was enlightened and his heartbeat accelerated. Ancestral Thunder Spirit. This is the newborn ancestral Thunder Spirit. According to the sect's records, this type of innate lightning spirit is very simple. You only need. Boom. Golden light flashed. The arm-thick thunder and lightning directly blew Ghost Lazy away, and he hung on a branch not far away. His whole body was scorched black, and he fainted. Caillou was shocked and felt a chill in his heart. He turned around and fled without saying a word. But before he escaped far, he heard a slight sound of surprise. Then he found that he was getting closer and closer to Su Li instead of being far away from her. What kind of demonic technique is this? Caillou was shocked and struggled desperately. But the more he struggled, the faster he retreated. Finally, he stopped in front of Su Li and could not move. Bloodstone? Su Li showed interest in her eyes. She stretched out her hand, and the gravel thrown aside by Caillou flew into her hand. The familiar smell came into her nose. The smell of the same origin, but Caillou's usage is more ingenious than mine. Although she was in the space of the giant tree just now, she was also familiar with everything that happened outside, including the killing move that Caillou used with the bloodstone. Caillou, Su Li said softly. Caillou raised his head subconsciously. When he saw the whirlpool in Su Li's eyes, he immediately fell into it and looked dull. Hearing the very familiar voice, Fan Zisong finally came to his senses. His body shook slightly. Before he could ask questions, he saw immortal Caillou suddenly bent over and half knelt down. His tone was full of fanaticism and loyalty. Master. Fan Zisong was completely lost. He looked up and saw Su Li's familiar eyes and delicate eyebrows. Senior fellow apprentice, I haven't seen you for a year. Don't you know me? In the hall of Mixin Peak. Immortal Mi Shin dismissed all the attendants and poured a cup of tea for Su Li respectfully. There was no lack of gratitude and awe in his eyes. He was seriously injured by Caillou just now and was about to die. But the woman in front of him just pointed at him gently, and most of his injuries were healed. Even his cultivation was slightly improved. This kind of ability couldn't be achieved unless she was a powerful person. Even the old ancestor who was practicing in isolation was not much different from her, and he was probably not the opponent of this senior. Although he didn't know how Fan Zisong got acquainted with her, it didn't prevent him from showing kindness to Su Li, senior fellow apprentice. Su Li called him softly, and called Fan Zisong, who was still in a daze, back to his senses. Fan Zisong smiled bitterly. The word junior sister apprentice was stuck in his chest for a long time, but he still couldn't make a sound. Finally, he sighed, Jinying, she is very good. I promised her a carefree life. If she wants to become stronger in the future, I will follow her. Su Li said and glanced at Immortal Mi Shin. Immortal Mi Shin immediately understood. After secretly instructing Fan Zisong to entertain the senior well, he left the hall. Fan Zisong smiled bitterly. Looking at Su Li, who was sitting at the table calmly, he had mixed feelings and a strange feeling in his heart. Was this still the introverted junior sister apprentice? Senior fellow apprentice, don't worry about it. Su Li said gently, if you hadn't brought me back to the sect from the mortal village, I wouldn't have recovered my cultivation so quickly. It may be a trivial matter for you, but for me, it's a great favor. Your master is afraid of me, but you don't have to. I still regard you as my senior fellow apprentice. As long as you don't change, I won't change. It was rare for Su Li to say such words sincerely. Fan Zisong was frightened, but he was more moved. It was extremely rare for a powerful person like the junior sister apprentice, who reincarnated to practice again, to put down her pride and tell him the truth. That was right. After experiencing the amazing scene just now, he had obviously regarded Su Li as a powerful person who reincarnated to practice again. Otherwise, he couldn't explain why Su Li became unfathomable in such a short time. Good karma reaps good karma. He had to say that he was very lucky. He just helped Su Li because of his childhood experience, but he would receive such an amazing return. Suddenly, He remembered all kinds of strange things that happened more than a year ago. His eyes changed, and he couldn't help but ask, what about the poisonous spirit-devouring insect? And Hong Yu? Seeing that Fan Zisong returned to normal, Su Li nodded with a chuckle. Yes, I helped you secretly. You don't have to worry about Hong Yu. She died a year ago, and she won't harm you again. Fan Zisong breathed a sigh of relief and smiled, showing his white teeth. He was not a stupid person. He quickly thought of the inexplicable victory 3 days ago and the self-refining of his physical body. It couldn't be anyone except Su Li. You came to Leiyuan sect not just to see me, right? After thinking for a moment, Fan Zisong asked. Although he felt that he had a good relationship with Su Li, he was not arrogant enough to think that Su Li would come to help him. Su Li nodded and said with a smile, Senior fellow apprentice, you have the heart of a powerful person. I think you won't refuse the opportunity to become stronger, right? Fan Zisong was slightly stunned, but Su Li didn't say much. She reached out and touched his glabella. Fan Zisong suddenly blacked out and fainted, but there was a golden thunder mark between his eyebrows. This is the mark of divine thunder of metal? Li Yin in the jade token was stunned. He was envious and gratified. All kinds of emotions were mixed together, and he didn't know what expression to show. Fan Zisong really got the mark of divine thunder. He was so lucky. Su Li withdrew her hand. She didn't make any movement, but the jade token hanging on Fan Zisong's neck flew to her. Come out. Su Li's tone was very light, but Li Yin heard the cold threat in it. He immediately looked bitter, and a transparent phantom floated out of it. He bowed and said, Second miss. You are well. Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly and said in a quiet tone, Grandpa Butler, I hope you are well. Many people lost their memory after coming out, but you still remember me. It seems that your origin is higher than I thought. Second miss, Li Yin felt cold. When he saw Su Li last time, she had just been brought into the sect by Fan Zisong. How long had it been? Had she recovered and far surpassed the level of her previous life? She is really the daughter of luck. She gathers the fortune of heaven and earth, and there is no bottleneck in her practice. Fate ancestor is right. As he thought so, he suddenly heard a series of cracking sounds. He suddenly looked up and saw Su Li spread out her hands, and a piece of jade powder fell. You don't need this kind of thing in the future, Su Li said lightly. She put her palm on Li Yin's head, and the endless ghost energy surged over. Should he continue to be a remnant soul or become a ghost practitioner? Su Li didn't give Li Yin the right to choose. An hour later, Li Yin put on a black robe. He felt helpless and relieved at the same time. Su Li gave him a way to live for the sake of Fan Zisong. Although his ghost body had Su Li's extremely strong personal mark, which made him have to surrender to her, it was better to live than to die. He still had many things to do. How could he die? The daughter of luck has no limit. Maybe it is not a bad thing for me to become like this. Under the influence of the mark, Li Yin's thoughts began to change uncontrollably. Although he clearly sensed this change, he could not feel evil. He even faintly began to think for Su Li and searched for useful information for Su Li in his memory. In the future, I will let Fan Zisong take over the Leiyuan sect. You will assist him by his side until he can take charge. Su Li gave an order, and Li Yin answered repeatedly. Seeing this, Su Li didn't say anything more. She got up and walked out of the hall. Under the guidance of immortal Mi Shin, she came to a aditum. There was only a stone bed in the aditum. Gui Lazy lay on it, and his chest rose and fell weakly. Gui Lazy is a spy of the holy sects. No wonder what? Su Li said to herself, but immortal Mi Shin didn't understand. However, he soon understood. Master. When he saw Gui Lazy get up from the stone bed, his eyes were confused for a moment, and he directly knelt in front of Su Li. He suddenly felt that his mind was in a mess. When he was about to ask, suddenly a gust of wind blew outside. Kai Yu, who recovered from his injury, came in and bowed his head respectfully. Master, the place where the old ancestor practices in isolation has been found. I will take you there now. Chapter 514. Although the old ancestor of Lei Yuan's sect was in the peak stage of nature's test, he was about to die. He was old and weak, so he closed his six senses and practiced in isolation. Su Li easily planted the seal of soul control in his body. So, in just 3 or 4 days, the entire Lei Yuan sect was under her control. Everything happened so fast that immortal Mi Xin couldn't accept it completely. However, he had been in the cultivation circle for many years. When he thought about it carefully, he didn't think there was any harm. Instead, there were many benefits. Since immortal Kai Yu and Gui Lazy were controlled by this person, he would no longer be targeted. In the future, Lei Yuan sect would be run by Fan Zisong. As Fan Zisong's teacher, he would not be in a bad situation. He comforted himself. Seeing the old figure in the forbidden area bowing to the beautiful woman, he couldn't help but have complex emotions in his heart. This time, Su Li did it in front of him. On the one hand, it was because she didn't have enough ability to stop it. On the other hand, it was because he didn't have a deep relationship with the old ancestor. If the old ancestor was his deceased master, he would make a different choice. Su Li didn't know the inner changes of immortal Mi Xin, and she didn't bother to know it. After solving the biggest obstacle of Lei Yuan's sect, she finally had the first slave of Junior Emperor. Although this slave was useless in the battle, he had lived long enough. It was good for him to explain the practice to Yang Zai and others. As for Fan Zisong, Li Yin would guide him when he woke up. She didn't need to worry about him. Seeing that they had wasted a lot of time here, Su Li ordered Yang Zai and others to go back and took Gui Lazy with them. It seems that I forgot something. At the gate of the mountain, Su Li looked back at the towering mountain. She waved her sleeves and disappeared in the sky with the wind. Old ancestor, you. In the forbidden area of the back mountain, First Elder widened his eyes and said in a trembling voice, "The Millennium Foundation of Lei Yuan sect." The skinny old man with dry hair said coldly, "Or you can take the seat on the platform of Lei Yuan sect." First Elder held his breath and quickly lowered his head in fear. "I dare not. I have my reasons for doing this. You just need to manage the sect well and assist the new young lord. You don't need to know the rest. Understand?" "I understand, I understand." The great elder nodded repeatedly and heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. After being warned like this by the ancestor, he didn't want anything else. All he wanted was to let go of all the mistakes he had made before, and that was the best result. In a clean quiet room in the back mountain of Ni sect. "Master, that's all I know." Gui Lazy stood respectfully in front of the stone table, his eyes full of awe. Su Li waved her hand, "Go back to Lei Yuan sect. You are still the disciple of immortal Kai Yu. Don't show any abnormality. If anything happens in Fenglei sect, report to me." "Yes, sir." After Gui Lazy left, Su Li returned to her resting place and sat down cross-legged. Divine Phoenix Lightning sect, she muttered to herself with a thoughtful look in her eyes. 1,200 years ago, Gui Lazy made a mistake in the holy sect of Wind and Thunder and was sent to Jojo region as a spy. He had not returned to the sect until now. However, he still got a lot of information about the major events that happened in the holy sect over the years through his connections. Among them, there was Reincarnation Realm. For the first time, she knew that not all holy sects agreed with the plan of Reincarnation Realm. Fenglei sect was one of the few holy sects that was extremely disgusted with Fate Ancestor and did not send disciples to Reincarnation Realm. In this way, Su Li had a good impression of Fenglei sect. However, that was all. At present, the plan was not finished, and she didn't really have the ability to protect herself in front of the holy sects. If it was not necessary, she didn't want to get in touch with any holy sects for the time being. Thinking of this, Su Li stopped thinking and focused her attention on the thing in her hand. This was a tattered booklet. Several pages were missing in the back, but it did not affect her reading the spells recorded in the front. There was a rather complicated pattern on one page. Blood-burning spell diagram. Su Li softly read the name next to the pattern and frowned slightly. She knew quite a few strange and uncanny techniques, but this was the first time she had seen such a strange technique. Kai Yu used this to stimulate the bloodstone, and his strength soared by more than 3 times in an instant. According to him, He met a dying evil practitioner in his early years and got it. He fumbled for hundreds of years before he accidentally learned it. Su Li groped the rough page, stared at the pattern for a moment, closed her eyes, and tried to outline the complete pattern in her mind. But only half of it was outlined, and the memory was inexplicably broken. It's weird. With my current realm, I have a photographic memory. But I can't remember this pattern. Su Li was interested and was about to try again, but she suddenly heard Su Bai's pitiful voice in her ear. Sister, I'm hungry. An hour later, Su Li returned to the stone room calmly, and her hair was still faintly charred. Although she could feel that the golden thunder seed bred by the divine thunder of earth in her body had advanced a step, the feeling of being struck by thunder was always uncomfortable. I still have a lot of substitutes, and it's not a problem to feed Su Bai in 10 years. 10 years later, after checking her external incarnation, Su Li sighed slightly and began to doubt whether it was right or wrong to abduct Su Bai. But when she thought of the legend of the thunder of tranquility that Black Lotus said, she dispelled the idea of sending Su Bai out. She had a hunch that she must get the thunder of tranquility, or she would not be able to resist some disasters. Taking a breath, Su Li's eyes became clear again. She got rid of the distractions and focused on the diagram. She wanted to ask Black Lotus about the diagram, but since she came back from Mount Fenglei, Black Lotus had been curled up and did not come out. She didn't know what he was doing. Time passed very quickly when she concentrated on practicing. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. In this year, with the help of Gui Lazy, the spy of holy sects, Ni sect found out most of the spies of holy sects in the 25 sects. Yang Zai and others attacked very quickly. By the end of the year, 19 sects in the 25 sects had fallen into their hands. Such a fast speed naturally caused some trouble, and the remaining 6 sects noticed that something was wrong. But after Su Li went out for a trip, Zhozhou region quickly returned to peace, and holy sects still knew nothing about it. On this day, it snowed in Zhozhou region, and the mountain behind the snow was covered with white, covering the traces of being struck by thunder for punishment. Su Li stood on the top of the mountain, facing the fine snow, but it was blocked by an invisible shield and flew away. Behind him, Yang Zai stood at the side. His aura was long and mellow. He'd taken over a dozen sects and forces in succession, and his temperament had undergone a tremendous change compared to 2 years ago. He faintly revealed a steady and dignified aura that was difficult to shake. But at this moment, there was a trace of respect on his face. Zai, your practice this year is slow, she said softly, and Yang Zai immediately smiled bitterly. Although he ran around this year, his cultivation did not fall behind. He had broken through to Huashan realm and stabilized in the middle stage of Huashan realm. This speed was enough to be proud of for any core disciple of holy sects, but the master even thought it was slow. You are right. Even so, Yang Zai still nodded with a bitter smile and did not refute. Su Li was suddenly speechless, and looked back with a smile. It's none of your business. I have devoted myself to research this year and forgot to help you practice. As she said, she turned over her palm, and a dozen jade bottles of different sizes appeared in her hand. Each jade bottle was marked with a name. When Yang Zai saw a jade token marked with his name in one of the bottles, he felt inexplicably familiar. Suddenly, his eyes brightened. Although he did not join the Leanly building in the reincarnation world, he also heard that the master's medical skills were unique in the world. The powder refined by the master could greatly improve the speed of practice. Could it be, every bottle of elixir I developed for you is unique? I wrote the usage and dosage in the bottle. Remember not to pass it to the wrong person, otherwise the consequences are unpredictable. Su Li waved her hand, and all the jade bottles flew up. Yang Zai caught them in a hurry and curled his lips helplessly. He did not have the sense of majesty just now. By the way, Master, I got the result of the information you asked me to inquire about. After putting away the jade bottles, he suddenly remembered one thing. He looked serious and said in a deep voice, someone indeed used your name to re-establish the Leanly building in Qingshui Circle. Su Li's eyes flashed. Do you know who the founder is? Yang Zai shook his head. The whereabouts of the fake Leanly building is very secretive. After it stole the immortal poisonous insect sound acquaintance from the Jigwang sect in Zholi region last year, it disappeared. There are few traces of it, but there are many rumors in the outside world. What did they say? Wasn't the holy sect in Zholi region destroyed last year? Yang Zai said and carefully looked at Su Li's side face. Now many people in the cultivation circle say that it was done by the Linli building, and it was done by you, master. Oh. Su Li raised her eyebrows and looked back at Yang Zai with a faint smile. What do you want to say? Yang Zai smiled embarrassedly. Master, please don't blame me. It's really hard to distinguish the truth from the falsehood when some information is put together. I also found out that in the gambling battle of immortal poisonous insect, the person of the Jigwang sect actually used the same pseudonym as you. The lord of the Jigwang sect is also coincidentally called Xian Jingju, and his wife's name is Su Yu. Hearing this, Su Li was suddenly stunned. What did you say? Yang Zai was also stunned. Master, you really don't know. Su Li couldn't hear the following words clearly. In her mind, only Su Yu, who died in front of her in the rainy night, full of worry and regret, repeatedly appeared. In this life, did Xian Jingju marry Su Yu? Then Xian and Su Li lifted the corners of her mouth, and a trace of joy naturally appeared in her eyes. At this moment, Yang Zai seemed to feel that even the gloomy sky was a little brighter. After a few breaths, Su Li's expression returned to calm, but her tone was much lighter. It was indeed me who killed the holy sect of Tianyin. Don't spread this matter. As for the Linli building, continue to pay attention to it. If you can find a way to join it, inform me immediately. Although Yang Zai had guessed it for a long time, when he heard Su Li admit it, he couldn't help but be shocked secretly. One person destroyed a sect. Master's cultivation progress was even more exaggerated than in the reincarnation world. Chapter 5:15. After Yang Zai left, only Su Li was left on the top of the mountain. The snow suddenly increased and fell from the sky like goose feathers. The world became quieter and quieter. Su Li's clothes were thin, and her eyes narrowed slightly. Somehow, she suddenly thought of the first day when she woke up in the second life in the reincarnation mirror. The same heavy snow and the same thin body, but at this moment, she could not feel the cold. In a year, she had thoroughly understood the bloodburn diagram. In essence, it was just to outline runes in her mind and create a strange power to stimulate the power in the bloodstone. According to Black Lotus, this was called visualization method, which was quite popular among the human clan in ancient times, but now it was lost and rarely seen. Visualization and the inhibition that I once came into contact with in Kang Lei's cave. There must be a reason why the powerful skills that have been passed down in antiquity times have been broken up until now. However, whenever I mention this matter, Black Lotus is vague about it. Is it because I haven't reached that level yet? Rubbing the surface of the ring between her fingers, Su Li withdrew her wandering thoughts and focused on her own practice again. The visualization technique consumed one's soul. Even she couldn't cultivate day and night, so she used the rest time to refine the spiritual jades. The energy of the spiritual jades entered her body, which was very comfortable and could slightly offset her fatigue. In just 1 year, she had eaten up all the spiritual jades compensated by the Huangxing Chamber of Commerce. The Sueyu seed is almost full and almost burst. The feeling of the body can't be wrong. It's time to go to the next level of Sueyu tactics. As Su Li thought, the Sueyu tactics in her body naturally showed the breath of breakthrough. In a moment, the next veil of Sueyu tactics was silently torn. The narrow top of the mountain was instantly shrouded by a mysterious breath. The nothingness was twisted like a multifaceted mirror. Even Su Li's figure was completely distorted. Kill, 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 kill. If the world doesn't tolerate you, you can kill your way out. Family, love, and siblings are all obstacles. Kill them all. The supreme way of peace can be high. The evil ghost behind her suddenly swelled, opened its big mouth full of sharp teeth, and swallowed the black air around Su Li's ear. The evil sound stopped abruptly. The body of the evil ghost fluctuated for a moment, and soon calmed down and returned to its original state. Su Li was interested in dipping her fingertips into a little residual breath, and thought, what was this? The test of breakthrough was too simple. Even if the evil ghost didn't swallow it, it couldn't shake her heart. Was her state of mind too strong? Su Li didn't think so. Her state of mind was different from that of ordinary practitioners, but even Yang Zai and others could easily bear the evil sound just now. In this way, the first level of Sueyu tactics that I have broken through is not a big deal. Even among the disciples who practiced this method in antiquity times, the second level was common. My physical cultivation had met the conditions of breakthrough, but I lacked the spiritual jades. Su Li sighed when she thought of it. This was the disadvantage of being a rogue cultivator. You obtained a mental cultivation method for free, but you didn't have the corresponding cultivation method. You could only rely on yourself to explore. If you could erase the time spent exploring, you would definitely be able to reduce the cultivation time to an extremely significant extent. Kueyu Palace. I'm afraid that there is only a word about this force in the ancient books of holy sects. It is too far away for me. Well, I can't rush to practice Sueyu tactics. I have to start from Chuangxing Path. Maybe the Star Hall will give me a surprise. Su Li calmed down and raised her right hand. It could be faintly seen that there was a layer of almost transparent grey film on her white skin, like a veil. Is this the change brought by the second level of Sueyu tactics? Su Li sensed carefully and tried to control the grey film. Suddenly, she felt that the grey film trembled slightly and emitted a very special smell. In fact, even Su Li didn't know what it was. Besides, there was no target around, so she didn't know the effect. Buzz after a faint buzz, the special smell spread to the surrounding area of 1,000 feet. It could no longer be maintained and drifted away. However, Su Li clearly felt that there seemed to be a small world within 1,000 feet. She even had a feeling that even if she took action, it would not be noticed by the natural law. Seeing this, Su Li thought of something and took all the smell back into her body. The surrounding area returned to normal. She immediately called softly, Black Lotus, with a black face, reluctantly came out of the ring. He couldn't hide the horror in his tone. Without my guidance, you actually learned the basic level of Sueyu tactic. Su Li tilted her head and her eyes flashed. Her smile was indescribably dangerous. It seems that you have already known the practice method of Sueyu tactics, but you didn't tell me. I didn't. Black Lotus immediately shook his head and said quickly, I only know that Sueyu tactics needs to be practiced with jade energy. I don't know anything else. You deliberately concealed such important information. Su Li still smiled. Tell me the reason, otherwise. Crack. A little electric light rose from her fingertip, which made Black Lotus's scalp numb. Thunder and lightning were everywhere in Mount Fenglei. In addition, Su Li ran the divine thunder in her body. He had been electrocuted badly enough. It took him a year to recover. Master, please calm down. I'll tell you, okay? Black Lotus was so aggrieved that he wanted to cry. It's true that Sueyu tactics is the core method of Kueyu Palace. But no one has practiced that mental method except the Palace Lord herself. And everyone who tried to practice it was crazy. Su Li looked cold. Why didn't you say it earlier? How dare I stop such a powerful person from giving you the method? Black Lotus faintly showed fear on his face, and I didn't expect that you could learn the basic level. Your practice method is not the same as that of the disciples of Kueyu Palace in those days. You didn't use the Pojing Jade. Su Li raised her eyebrows. Didn't you just say that you didn't know the specific practice method of Kueyu Palace? Black Lotus immediately covered his face. How could he accidentally spill the beans? I didn't say it because I was afraid. I underestimated the people in the world, underestimated. Su Li. Forget it. If I want to be the enemy of the holy sects in those days, I can't let go of any means to become stronger. So what if I am crazy? Even if I am really crazy, I will be a madman that makes the fate ancestor tremble. Su Li's eyes were extremely cold, and her tone seemed to have no temperature, which made Black Lotus break into a cold sweat. Was the master going further and further on the road of madness? The scene of a crazy woman being besieged by hundreds of holy sects naturally emerged in his mind, and his lips trembled suddenly. He felt that even for himself, It was necessary to stop Su Li from becoming a madman. Master, don't rush to extremes. Since the Lord of Kueyu Palace can practice Sueyu tactics, you may also be able to. When you learned the basic level just now, did you hear the bewitching sound in your ears? Su Li smiled and nodded, yes. Black Lotus instantly felt that he was trapped, but he didn't think so much at the moment. He frowned and said, this is a sign of being possessed by the devil. The devil I mentioned is not the person of the evil circle, but the real demons and ghosts. Master, if you are bewitched by the sound, you will lose your mind. At that time, you can't even maintain a human shape. You will be like a pig and a dog, and become a low-level demon who only knows killing. Oh! Su Li twisted her fingertips, as if she was recalling the feeling just now. The sound is not a threat to me at all. It can't affect me at all. Master, you are just at the basic level now. Don't underestimate the sound. Black Lotus sighed and thought of those disciples he saw in Kueyu Palace. Their reactions were exactly the same as Su Li's. Now the sound is not powerful. When it finds that it can't do anything to you, it will be dormant and wait for the opportunity to take action. It can even absorb the pneuma you emit to strengthen itself. When you break through Sueyu tactics next time, the second sound will also be born. At that time, the two sounds will be heard, and the bewitching effect will be greatly improved. Next time, it will be 3. Wait. Su Li suddenly interrupted Black Lotus's words and said strangely, you said the sound will be dormant? Yes. Black Lotus nodded naturally. Anyone who had stayed in Kueyu Palace knew that although he went to steal, he remembered all this common sense when he was carrying things. Su Li's smile widened, and she chuckled, I know where the sound is. Ah! Black Lotus was stunned for a moment, and then he saw the little master pointed to her shadow and said helplessly, it seems to have eaten something terrible. Black Lotus was even more confused. Evil Ghost was born to restrain the sound of magic. There was no precedent in the past. Su Li was the first, and Black Lotus fell into a long tangle. Su Li didn't think so much. There was still a long time before the next breakthrough of Sueyu tactics. For her, Sueyu tactics was just one of the means to enhance her strength. She knew too many things. Sometimes, it's not a good thing to know too many things. Back to the Adatum, Su Li put Black Lotus aside and began to sort out and summarize what she had learned. She extracted the essence and got rid of the dregs, which was extremely necessary before she went on the Chuangxing path again. First of all, physical practice. Thanks to countless natural disasters, her physical body was repeatedly refined. Cuishing's swordsmanship and punching method could no longer improve the physical strength. She still remembered that when she went on the Chuangxing path last time, she didn't dare to use the 10th move at all. Although that move was powerful, it consumed 80% of her genuine energy. But now, with the 10th move, she could wave hundreds of times in the blink of an eye with her physical body alone. Su Li tried to practice the 11th move, but was reminded by Black Lotus that she lacked the characteristics of the school and it was difficult to comprehend. This was not caused by the understanding, but the characteristics of the school. She didn't plan to leave the Jojo region to find it in a short time, so she had to leave it temporarily. The punching method had been completely reduced to a means of attack, and was no longer a way to improve. As for the harvest in the reincarnation mirror, the Ghost Valley meditation direction had been completely comprehended by her, and even innovated. After combining with her memory in Qingshui Circle, it completely evolved into a new and unique school of refining medicine. After she realized the destruction sword intent of AO sword skills, all the moves in it were meaningless. Only the quenching method of sword intent was left, and the others were abandoned. After her rebirth, she had the body of Evil Ghost, and then encountered the Divine Thunder. The Evil Ghost emerged behind Su Li. She looked back at her past face and smiled. Su Li, you finally live like a human. Chapter 516. 3 days later, Su Li came out of practice, and Hua Yang immediately came to find her. The sects that are easier to control have all been taken care of. The next sects are all connected with each other. The old ancestors have a close relationship. If we pull a hair, it will affect the whole sect. It's not easy to handle. Su Li thought for a moment and reached out her hand. Do you have the relationship chart of the sects? Hua Yang smiled proudly. Of course I do. Otherwise, the network I've built would be wasted. Then she took out a jade slip from the universe ring and handed it to Su Li. Su Li took it and scanned it with her divine awareness. She immediately knew all the relationships between the 25 sects. Seeing Su Li was thinking, Hua Yang didn't disturb her and waited quietly. After a while, Su Li suddenly frowned with interest. What's the matter with the Immortal Cultivation sect? The head of the sect is in the early stage of Yuanying realm. There are many sects like this in Jojo region. Why can it become one of the 25 sects? That's right. Hua Yang chuckled and seemed to have expected Su Li's curiosity. She immediately explained, the Immortal Cultivation sect ranks last among the 25 sects, but it has been steadily occupying the position of the 25 sects for thousands of years. Why? Speaking of it, it has a lot to do with the strategy of the head of the sect. The inheritance of the Immortal Cultivation sect has long been broken, but it has exported a lot of good seedlings to the other 25 sects in the early years. Now those seedlings have grown into towering trees, and in turn, they protect the Immortal Cultivation sect. In this way, those sects who want to rise would rather choose a more powerful sect to occupy than a small sect with endless troubles. Su Li didn't comment on the answer and said meaningfully, people's hearts are the most changeable, not to mention in the cultivation circle. Don't you think it's strange that the Immortal Cultivation sect can enjoy the treatment of the 25 sects by relying on its favor? Hua Yang was slightly stunned. Hearing Su Li's words, she also felt strange and said in an uncertain tone, maybe it's luck? Su Li smiled and waved her hand. The relationship chart of the Immortal Cultivation sect appeared in the nothingness. She pointed to several places. The inner elder of Qianluo Valley, the chief law enforcement elder of Shenbing sect, the protector of Flying Silver cult. Every position occupied by Immortal Cultivation sect is not conspicuous, but they have real power. If these people are really loyal to Immortal Cultivation sect. Hua Yang, do you still think that Immortal Cultivation sect is weak? Hua Yang's body trembled slightly, and her pupils shrank. You mean, halfway through her words, she seemed to have suddenly thought of something and revealed a look of realization. No wonder. Li, if you didn't mention it, I would have forgotten it. When Yang Zai went to conquer the Immortal Cultivation sect, he said that the journey was very smooth. The Lord did not resist at all and even wanted to send some excellent disciples to the sect. Yang Zai felt strange and refused. The Lord did not insist, so the matter was over. Now I think. Hua Yang shivered inexplicably. Her impression of the Immortal Cultivation sect suddenly changed from weak to mysterious and treacherous. Let Yang Zai contact the Lord of the Immortal Cultivation sect and arrange a core disciple identity for me. Su Li suddenly said. Hua Yang was shocked and immediately nodded. I will be ready and wait for your news. If the Immortal Cultivation sect was really so powerful, if she could completely control this sect, she could take in all the 25 sects except Yushu sect and Zihon sect at once. This was the fastest shortcut. She was not worried about Su Li's safety. Not many people knew the truth of the destruction of the Tianyin tribe, and she happened to be one of them. Su Li could even bring down the holy sects, not to mention a small sect with a little mysterious atmosphere. The Immortal Cultivation sect was located in a very remote mountain range. Su Li, wearing a bright and beautiful silk dress of female disciples of the Ni sect, stopped under the dilapidated mountain gate. Glancing at the dark sky, she frowned slightly. This place made her feel a little uncomfortable, but she couldn't tell what it was that made her uncomfortable. On the second day after Yang Zai conveyed the order, the Immortal Cultivation sect immediately agreed without showing the slightest resistance. Su Li estimated that she still needed some time to consolidate before going to Chuangxing Path. She had nothing else to do, so she directly packed up and pretended to be an ordinary disciple of the Ni sect. It took her a few days to rush here. You must be the new junior sister apprentice. Su Li didn't stand for a long time, and then a gentle voice came. She raised her head and saw a white flowing light falling in front of her in the blink of an eye. The light dissipated, and a young man in a white robe appeared in front of her. The young man's face was a little abnormal pale, and there was a hint of childishness in him. He had waist-length hair, and looked less than 100 years old. His body was extremely thin, as if he could not stand the wind. His whole body showed a sense of femininity, but his cultivation was surprisingly high, reaching the late stage of Jindan realm. There was also a kind of obscure energy that even Su Li felt was not simple lurking in his body. The immortal cultivation sect is really not simple. It's right to come here. Su Li thought quickly in her mind, but she seemed to be scared on the surface. She blushed and hurriedly saluted, Su. Su. Yu greets you, senior fellow apprentice. Seeing that Su Li was so embarrassed, the young man was also slightly stunned. He originally thought that the Ni sect would send someone not simple to probe them, so the master asked him to go down the mountain to greet them in person, so as not to reveal any flaws. Today, the one he met when he went down the mountain was not a simple-minded female disciple. However, it would take time to see whether this woman was really simple-minded or not. Although there were many thoughts in his mind, he did not show any sluggishness on the surface. He automatically played the role of the elder brother and nodded, it's getting late. Follow me to the mountain to meet the master first. Su Li's eyes showed doubts, senior fellow apprentice, the master is. The young man suddenly smiled gently, the lord of our immortal cultivation sect. Ah! The equally young girl's almond-shaped eyes were round and full of nervousness. She grabbed the corner of her clothes and stammered, senior fellow apprentice. I haven't washed my clothes for several days. It's not good to meet the lord, is it? The young man, a moment later, in the main hall of the lord. The young man stood aside respectfully, leaving Su Li, who was coy all over, standing in the middle alone. She lowered her head uneasily. On the throne, He Ju, the old lord of the immortal cultivation sect in a brown robe, looked at Su Li with kindness in his eyes. Child, raise your head and let me have a look. Su Li raised her head obediently. It was an ordinary face, which was absolutely ugly in the cultivation circle. He Ju stared for a moment, but did not see any trace of the spell that changed her appearance. In Huajian sect, the predecessor of Ni sect, there was indeed a female disciple named Su Yu. She was extremely young and was originally the disciple of Immortal Hong Yu. Later, after Immortal Hong Yu died, she became an ordinary Naiman branch disciple of Ni sect. It was no problem to trace her origin. So, what did Ni sect mean by sending this girl to the sect? Testing. He Ju thought for a long time. Seeing the girl in the hall lowering her head in fear, he couldn't help but laugh. She was just an ordinary female disciple. Even if she was used some means, he had nothing to be afraid of. The rise of Ni sect is full of strangeness. Recently, they have been playing small tricks and contacting with the other 25 sects a lot. They want Jojo region, which is not in conflict with my purpose. All kinds of thoughts passed through the old man's mind, and he simply asked Su Li a few questions, which were all consistent with the intelligence he secretly investigated. He smiled and waved to the weak lad. Since you are sent to my immortal cultivation sect, you will be my 12th pro-disciple in the future. Although there are few disciples in my sect and few people are willing to stay, those who stay are pure and don't scheme against each other like the big sects. What do you think? The girl was completely stunned. It seemed that she didn't expect that there would be such a big pie in the world. But she soon calmed down, with a little hesitation on her face, as if she thought of some bad memories. But she didn't hesitate for a long time, and knelt down respectfully. Her crisp and tender voice resounded through the hall. Disciple Su Yu, pay respect to master. He Ju immediately stroked his beard and smiled. The little girl was really simple, and all her thoughts were revealed on her face. He got up, walked down from the throne, and helped Su Li up. Looking at the innocent face with some doubts, he laughed and said sincerely, "It doesn't matter if Ni sect doesn't want you. This is your home in the future." The girl's eyes turned red. It seemed that she thought of many bad things, and her voice was a little choked. "Thank you, Master." After that, There was a young girl who was always chattering and asking questions beside the effeminate-looking youth. Most of the time, it was the effeminate-looking youth who answered helplessly, but he did not show any impatience. He seemed to be a very patient person by nature, and he was very popular in the sect. During this period, Su Li also got the boy's name, a strange name, Wen Hun. A few days later, the news that the Lord had accepted a new personal disciple also spread. Although the Immortal Cultivation sect was a small sect, there were hundreds of disciples in Naiman Branch and Naiman Branch. This news didn't cause any waves, which made Su Li feel a little strange. She should be a girl with no schemes at the moment, so she asked directly. Senior fellow apprentice Wen, I have become the master's personal disciple. Don't those senior fellow apprentices and senior sisters who entered the sect earlier than me have any reaction? In the book pavilion, Su Li followed the emaciated boy. After several times of hesitation, she finally asked. Wen Hun put down the scroll in his hand unhurriedly, and said dumbly, I know you can't bear it for a long time, and you will ask. But this is not a secret. In our Immortal Cultivation sect, whether you are in Naiman Branch, or personal disciple, you can enjoy the same treatment of cultivation resources. There is no restriction on identity to enter and exit the book pavilion. Why do they envy you? All the same. Su Li blinked her eyes. She was really surprised this time. Our sect is so poor. How can we support so many people? Wen Hun's pale face blushed. He seemed to be angry and helpless. Our sect is so poor. When you receive the first month's salary, you will know why. The first month's salary? Su Li repeated. She wanted to continue to ask, but saw Wen Hun's figure flashed and disappeared in the distance instantly. He slipped away. Chapter 5:17. Seeing that Wen Hun really ran away, Su Li didn't chase him. She picked up the book that Wen Hun read just now and opened it. It turned out to be a strange essays, which had nothing to do with cultivation. Although Wen Hun and He Ju are good to me, and the attitude of the disciples of the sect is also kind, I always feel that the sect lacks something. Su Li opened a page of essays and saw an illustration scribbled on it. It was a barren deep mountain with a thatched hut standing alone. Is it vitality? Su Li read the essays thoughtfully. The essays were composed of many stories, and each story was quite scary. The first story was about the thatched hut. The scholar went to the capital city for the examination and passed through the barren mountain. After entering the mountain, it rained cats and dogs. He had no place to rest. Suddenly, he saw a light in the distant deep mountain. He was overjoyed and ran to the hut to knock on the door regardless of the mud under his feet. Squeak, the door was opened a little, and a beautiful face of a woman appeared. Except for the face, everything else was immersed in the darkness. Husband, come in quickly to take shelter from the rain. Seeing that she was alone, the scholar immediately waved his hand and said, It's really inappropriate for you and me to live alone in this deep mountain. Husband, come in quickly to take shelter from the rain. The woman's face was very stiff, and only her lips were moving, as if she could only say this sentence. The scholar felt a little strange, but he saw that the book box behind him had leaked the rain. He didn't care so much, and pushed the door and walked in. Su Li turned the next page, but it was blank. She was slightly stunned, and continued to turn the page. It was the next story. She turned it again, but it was also blank at the end. There was no ending. A story without an ending? Su Li pursed her lips slightly, and suddenly heard a familiar voice. Junior sister apprentice, it's late. You should go back to have a rest. Her pupils shrank, and she jumped away like a frightened rabbit. The book in her hand was also thrown out, but was caught by the person who spoke. Wen Hun turned around with a smile. The candlelight flickered, and could only illuminate his face. Junior sister apprentice, it's late. You should go back to have a rest. Senior fellow apprentice. Su Li called, and felt very strange. With her perception, she didn't find that Wen Hun had returned. Junior sister, it's getting late. You should go back and rest. When the voice sounded for the third time, Su Li was shocked. Looking at Wen Hun's stiff and pale face like a dead man, she immediately thought of the strange story in the barren mountain she just read. Ghosts really exist in this world. But if there was, then what was she? Her mind was filled with doubts. Suddenly, she sensed an instinctive thought from the evil ghost. Hungry, hungry? Su Li stared at Wen Hun with a stiff smile. It turned out that this thing was for eating. She abruptly turned her gaze and looked at the huge library. Different from the day, the library seemed to have lost its color at night. It was so quiet that even the croaking of frogs and insects outside the door could not be heard. How much food is there? As she turned her gaze away, she didn't see her senior's face suddenly split open from the middle, revealing rows of densely packed teeth. Wen Hun also didn't see that the shadow behind Su Li suddenly moved to his feet and opened its bloody mouth quietly. Junior sister apprentice. An anxious voice traveled into the library through the gloomy sky. There was a strange vibration in the voice, and under this vibration, the library regained its lively colors. The oppressive atmosphere immediately faded, and various sounds poured into the ears once more. She looked up at the outside of the attic. It turned out to be evening. Wen Hun waved his hand nervously in front of Su Li. Seeing her eyes full of doubts, he breathed a sigh of relief. He came just in time. If the junior sister apprentice was harmed by the ghosts here because of his negligence, his Taoist heart would inevitably have flaws and turn into an evil thought. Hey, senior fellow apprentice. Didn't you say it was late? Why is it only evening? Su Li pointed to the Jinwu hanging in the sky outside the window, and began to test straightforwardly. Wen Hun looked serious. He glanced at the library, which became gloomy because of Su Li's words, and took Su Li away without saying anything. Until they returned to the courtyard where the personal disciples lived, he let go of Su Li's hand and faintly breathed a sigh of relief. He warned seriously, "Little junior sister apprentice, if I don't accompany you, don't go to the library alone." Su Li touched her palm. The touch just now was very cold, not like the hand of a living person. Wen Hun's face suddenly became hot. He hadn't held a woman's hand before. In a hurry just now, fortunately, Su Li didn't care. She just blinked and said, "Why?" Seeing the little junior sister apprentice was determined to get to the bottom of it, Wen Hun remembered the master's entrustment in his heart. He wanted to say something several times but stopped on second thought. Finally, he couldn't help saying, "Our immortal cultivation sect is not as simple as it seems. Don't ask so much. Practice hard, and you will know it later. There are several dangerous places in the sect. Even I don't dare to go there at night. I will mark them for you. You should remember them." As he said, he took out a blank piece of rice paper and grabbed a writing brush. Su Li stood quietly aside and stared at the bird's-eye view of the sect that slowly appeared under Wen Hun's pen. As expected, this scene fell into He Ju's eyes. Wen Hun trusts people too easily. In the dark hall, He Ju's face full of age spots showed a trace of helplessness. However, it may be a chance for him to transform. He accepted Su Yu as a personal disciple. Firstly, he wanted to give an explanation to Ni sect and maintain the superficial image. Secondly, he wanted to test whether Su Yu was real. If this woman was really a spy of Ni sect in disguise, he could pretend for a while, but he couldn't maintain the illusion all the time. After observing for a few days, he didn't think there was any big problem. At least, this girl was indeed the little girl named Su Yu. Her bone age was also very young. She was simple and straightforward. As for whether she had been played any tricks by Ni sect, he couldn't see it in a short time. In the following days, Su Li obediently followed Wen Hun's words every day and practiced seriously. She also learned the authentic mental method of Immortal Cultivation Sect, Immortal Cultivation Tactics, under the guidance of Wen Hun. She didn't do anything out of line. After all, the sect was full of weirdness. It was hard to guarantee that He Ju would have a way of prying that she couldn't detect. There were still 9 years before the 10-year period. She still had enough time, so she didn't need to rush at this time. A month passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, it was finally the time to receive the monthly salary. Su Li followed Wen Hun and came to the only large square of Immortal Cultivation Sect. At this moment, there were hundreds of disciples standing sparsely in the square. It looked very deserted in the large square, which seemed to reflect the decline of immortal cultivation sect. A woman in black whom Su Li had never seen stood in front of the long stone table with a cold look and stood silently. On the long stone table, there were hundreds of wooden boxes, each of which was 1/2 meter long and wide. Seeing Wen Hun coming over, she showed a kind smile on her face. But in Su Li's eyes, it was a little ferocious. "Well, everyone is here. You, give out the monthly salary." He Ju stooped and stepped forward. The woman in black showed respect on her face and nodded slightly. She waved her hand and scattered hundreds of wooden boxes on the table. Every wooden box fell into the hands of every disciple accurately, including Su Li. She took the wooden box floating in front of her, and her hands suddenly sank. The things in it weighed at least 100 kilograms. For the sake of prudence, she didn't use her divine awareness to check. "So many. The amount of this month is so enough. I can finally eat my fill. I'm so happy," the disciples in the square said joyfully, which made Su Li feel more and more strange. But she didn't ask more because of the occasion. "This month's salary is brought by your senior sister apprentice Yu. Thank her quickly." After He Ju spoke, everyone immediately came to their senses and saluted to the woman in black. "Thank you, senior sister apprentice Yu." The woman in black still looked cold. She just nodded slightly and glanced at He Ju. After getting his consent, she turned around and disappeared into the mountain. "Senior sister apprentice Yu is..." Su Li couldn't help but transmit the sound to Wen Hun. Although the young man felt it was wrong to whisper under the nose of the master, he still replied, "She is an elder of our sect. She usually practices in the deep mountain. As for the title of senior sister apprentice, it is requested by senior sister apprentice Yu. She is still young and doesn't want to be called old." Su Li was about to ask something else, but He Ju's voice suddenly interrupted her. "It's not easy for our immortal cultivation sect to persist from ancient times to today." He Ju walked to the stone table and looked at the disciples below. His kind face was a little more dignified. "Now the inheritance of the sect is broken, and there are only the first 3 hurdles of the immortal cultivation tactics. The highest level is Yuanying realm. You have to explore by yourself. It's fate for you to join our sect. The sect can't provide you with a place for cultivation, so it's fate but not fate. If anyone wants to leave the sect today, I will never blame you. Now, if you want to go down the mountain to find another chance, come out." As He Ju said, a pair of turbid eyes suddenly fell on several people in the field. Those people immediately sighed and stood up unwillingly. They then bowed to He Ju and took their leave. There were even some who were reluctant to leave. They wiped their tears as they walked down the mountain. Su Li was confused. She could see that these people didn't want to leave the immortal cultivation sect at all. If He Ju didn't call them out, they would definitely not stand out. What was worth staying in this immortal cultivation sect? Could it be, as He Ju said, that it was true love? With all kinds of doubts in her heart, Su Li returned to her residence. She opened the wooden box and saw the fresh meat with blood in it. Then she was lost in thought. A piece of meat. No wonder some people say that they can eat their fill. Su Li suddenly understood and felt it was absurd. She had never seen such a weird sect. What was worth staying in a sect that couldn't even eat their fill? "Little junior sister apprentice, are you there?" Wen Hun's voice came from outside the yard. Su Li happened to be confused, so she dragged him into the house without saying anything. "I know you are confused now. I was the same when I first came here." Wen Hun looked at Su Li with a smile. "Little junior sister apprentice, how long have you not eaten?" Chapter 518. Eat. Su Li was stunned, and asked with confusion, "After practitioners reach Shuji realm, we don't need to live with a full stomach. If it's delicious food, we can taste it. Why do we need to maintain 3 meals? Wen Hun chuckled, "You're right. Although this piece of meat is not as delicious as you think, its effect is very special. To a large extent, the disciples who stay in the sect don't want to leave because of this piece of meat." "I see. What's the effect of this piece of meat?" Su Li asked immediately, but Wen Hun shook his head. "This is a big secret of the sect. It won't work if I say it. After you eat this piece of meat and know its effect, don't tell others. Otherwise, something bad will happen. Su Li wanted to ask what the bad thing was, but she was stopped by Wen Hun's eyes. After a while, Wen Hun left the yard. He also had to maintain his own practice, and it was impossible to keep an eye on Su Li all the time. Su Li stared at the basin-sized meat for a while, and then got up, covered the wooden box, and took it to the kitchen. Her yard was on the hillside of the main peak, next to Wen Hun's yard. Although the yard was small, it was well equipped, and even an underground ice cellar was equipped. Su Li didn't know the use of the ice cellar at first, but now she understood that it was specially used to store meat. Su Li cut a long strip of fat and lean meat from the meat, and returned to the kitchen to boil water. Then she found all the seasonings sealed in the window meticulously. Who knew how many years had passed since the last time he cooked properly? With a subtle emotion lingering in her heart, she was more agile. This scene was naturally seen in the water mirror in front of Hee-ju. Su Yu was born in the secular world and had a miserable life experience. She was familiar with secular farm chores since she was a child. Such familiar actions couldn't be faked, and her age and identity matched. The ghosts in the book pavilion didn't kill her, which meant that this woman was not poisoned. After all, those ghosts liked strange secret skills. If they really poisoned her, even Wen Hun couldn't stop those ghosts. Hee-ju confirmed it again and again, and his expression eased. At this moment, he finally gave up the idea of continuing to probe. We can't wait for the centennial salary ceremony. With Wen Hun's physique, he should guard the sect for only 1 month. There should be no big mistake. Senior brother, I've been in the sect for a month. Why haven't I seen any other senior brothers or sisters? Master also said that I'm his 12th disciple. At the gate of the hall of the sect, Su Li and Wen Hun sat on the cold steps and looked at the deep mountain covered by thick fog. I'm the 11th. Wen Hun sighed and replied. He wanted to go back and cultivate. Why was it that when Master went out, he didn't give the task of guarding to senior sister Yu and the others, but gave it to him instead? Guarding the sect was really boring. After guarding the hall alone for a few days, he finally couldn't bear it and forced Su Li to guard with him. The feeling of loneliness was diluted a little. As for what his master had told him before he left, he had already forgotten about it during those few days of suffering. If NI sect really wanted to send a spy, how could they send such a simple and young junior sister apprentice? Based on Su Yu's character, she might have been cheated and still helped others to earn money. How could she be a spy? What about the other 10 senior brothers and sisters? Su Li blinked, and her clear and pure black eyes were full of curiosity. Every time Wen Hun met such a clean gaze, he didn't want to show his hypocrisy. He could only sigh again and shook his head. I don't know, little junior sister apprentice. I have practiced for less than 100 years. Since I became a disciple of Master, I haven't seen any other senior brother apprentice except you. She reached Yuanying realm in less than 100 years. Su Li was slightly shocked, but she showed surprise and envy on the surface. Senior fellow apprentice is amazing. After saying this, she was disappointed again. Compared with senior fellow apprentice's talent, I'm too ordinary. If a senior fellow apprentice hadn't given me the great opportunity of the sect, I couldn't have reached Jindan realm at all. Wen Hun saw that his inadvertent words hit the little junior sister apprentice, and felt ashamed. He said repeatedly, "Junior sister apprentice, don't worry about it. I can practice so fast because of the means given by Master. Before I joined the sect, I was just a little beggar who was seriously ill and dying." As he said, he touched his cold skin. Master said that my life had come to an end. This method can change my fate, and I did survive. Su Li wanted to ask what the method was. But when she saw Wen Hun was in a trance, she thought for a while and didn't do anything. If she kept asking questions, Wen Hun would notice the problem even if he was stupid. In the twinkling of an eye, Wen Hun didn't need to guard the hall at night. He returned to the residence with Su Li. He cheekily ate a meal in Su Li's courtyard, and then went back. The cold moonlight shone like a layer of silver light on the stone road. Wen Hun looked back at the small yard standing in the forest, and sighed habitually. If Master imparted the holy method to the little junior sister apprentice and went to the book pavilion to practice in isolation for several years, what should I do with my mouth? 2 days ago, he smelled the fragrance from Su Li's courtyard, and couldn't help but go to have a look. After seeing that the meat became delicious food in the hands of the little junior sister apprentice, he tasted it. Immediately, he fell in love with Su Li completely, and gave his share of meat to Su Li, just to have a meal every day. After thinking for a while, Wen Hun couldn't think of a good way, so he sighed again and turned away. After Su Li saw Wen Hun off, she closed the gate of the courtyard and returned to the adytum for practice in the house. After hanging up the sign of Do Not Disturb practice, everything around was quiet. Only the candlelight in the adytum flickered from time to time, and Su Li's shadow was printed on the wall, like a demon baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. These meats can improve my soul slightly. Su Li pretended to practice, but thousands of thoughts flashed through her mind. She was a little dignified. My soul has reached the perfect nature soul. If I can accumulate a little more, I may be able to break through to the next realm forcibly, and reach the half-immortal soul, which is comparable to the Darching practitioner. Even I can benefit from it, let alone those ordinary disciples. No wonder they are unwilling to leave. After the improvement of my soul, my mind is agile. As for me, I can easily release tens of millions of thoughts in an instant when I reach the perfect nature soul. No matter what I learn, I can learn quickly. Those ordinary disciples may not be able to absorb the power in the meat as perfectly as I can, but, as long as their souls are improved a little, they can comprehend the mental method several times faster. After figuring it out, Su Li opened her eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. It's really fascinating. But cultivation pays attention to the balance of yin and yang, and the soul is the yin soul. If the yin soul is too strong, it will lead to the lack of yang energy and damage to the physical body. If it is not balanced to the extreme and explodes, it can even suck up all the nutrients in the physical body in an instant, and the physical body will die instantly. No wonder. Su Li's eyes brightened slightly. In an instant, she felt that the clouds and mist were dispelled, and she was suddenly enlightened. No wonder the immortal cultivation sect was short of vitality. Everyone's yin soul was too strong, which led to the lack of vitality. However, ordinary disciples couldn't feel this. They were only addicted to the pleasure of improving their souls and couldn't extricate themselves. So, He-Ju drove them away from the sect. In this way, the puzzle is solved. Only the dangerous places mentioned by Wen Hun are left. While muttering to herself, Su Li glanced at the candlestick, and the candlelight went out instantly. Although she learned from Wen Hun that He-Ju had left the sect, she was not sure whether He-Ju was testing her or not. So, she simply observed for a few more days. Senior fellow apprentice, I'm so bored. What did the master do? Why does he ask you to guard the sect? Su Li sat beside the steps, put her hands on her knees, and sighed. Helplessness flashed on Wen Hun's pale face, and he also sighed heavily. I don't know. The master said that he would come back in 1 month. Just 1 month. Only 7 days have passed. Wen Hun's resentment was more obvious. If he was practicing, he wouldn't feel bored. But he could only stand in front of the hall every day, which was really boring. Why does the hall of the sect need someone to guard it? Su Li looked back at the closed door. When the master was there, we also went in, but there was nothing in it. Maybe there is something we can't see. It seemed that Su Li reminded him of something. Wen Hun looked thoughtful. After a while, his eyes flickered, and he glanced at Su Li, who was absent-minded beside him. His lips moved, but he finally held back and didn't say much. If he said too much and scared the junior sister apprentice away, no one would accompany him. Su Li saw that he was in a dilemma. She laughed in her heart and didn't insist. The daily intake of the soul power of that piece of meat was limited. Including the piece that Wen Hun gave her, it was just enough for her to eat for a month. He-Ju left for a month, and she still had enough time. It was better to wait until her soul power accumulated to the limit, and then find out the truth. Su Li originally thought so. But on the 10th day, when she and Wen Hun came to the hall of the sect, she suddenly felt something wrong. It was so quiet. There was no sound around, and even the sound of the wind disappeared. Senior fellow apprentice, the sky seems to be darkening. Su Li looked up, and there was panic and fear in her eyes. She couldn't help but grasp Wen Hun's clothes tightly. Don't be afraid. I'm here. It seemed that it was not the first time for Wen Hun to see this kind of scene. His expression was very calm, but his body was tight. He kept glancing around, as if looking for something. Suddenly, he fixed his eyes and looked at a void. Su Li looked along the void, but saw nothing. With a thought, she transferred part of her power to the evil ghost. The eyes of the evil ghost in the shadow opened a little bit, and a huge and slender black snake immediately came into view. It was about 1,000 feet long, and it kept hovering in the sky. Black mist kept spurting out from the gaps of its scales, turning into strange dark clouds. Hiss! The huge snake head emerged from the hovering snake body. It flicked its blood-red tongue, and 2 red lines as thin as earthworms slowly shot to the 2 people on the ground. This is the bloody red in the deep mountain. Why does it come out? Wen Hun was shocked, and his pupils contracted sharply. He grabbed Su Li and fled to the hall without saying a word. Chapter 519. Senior fellow apprentice, don't talk. Wen Hun clenched the hands behind him tightly, with sweat on his forehead. Grey light surged in his eyes. He saw the gate of the hall covered by the black fog at a glance, and then rushed out. The distance that could be crossed into the hall in a few steps was suddenly stretched at this moment, and seemed extremely far. Junior sister apprentice, don't make a sound. We will be safe after entering the hall. Wen Hun transmitted the sound subconsciously, but it was transmitted in the air. He was stunned, and the warm and soft feeling in his right hand immediately became cold and slippery. At this moment, Wen Hun's face changed dramatically. He suddenly threw away the thing in his hand, and saw a slender snake was thrown far away. Then it hissed unwillingly and bit Wen Hun. Puff! The grey knife light ran from the head of the snake to the tail, and instantly split the red snake into 2 halves, which fell to the ground with a clatter. Little junior sister apprentice was gone. Grey light flashed in Wen Hun's eyes, and he shook off the blood on the transparent blade. When he looked up and saw the huge red snake circling above his head, the fear in his heart was drowned by anger. He stopped running away. Little junior sister apprentice, I won't let anything happen to you. In the thick black fog, Su Li's bun loosened, and her long hair draped behind her like a waterfall. She stood alone in the center, letting the wind blow. She looked up for a moment, and then withdrew her gaze. She used the sword to pick up the long red snake on the ground that messed up her hair. Black Lotus, what is this? Black Lotus appeared. He didn't look at the dead snake on the ground, but at the sky. He licked his lips, and his eyes were full of rare excitement. These things are called ghosts. They are your natural enemies and also good things. Su Li raised her eyebrows, and then chuckled. It seems that this thing is also useful to you. Yes. Black Lotus didn't hide his greed. I didn't expect that there are ghosts in the present world. It seems that there are unimaginable sins hidden in Qingshui Circle. Ghosts? Su Li repeated, and continued to ask with interest. Such an attitude of disregard seemed to annoy the existence in the sky. Its body trembled, and countless red spots fell. They turned into dense long snakes in the air and shot over. But they were cut into pieces by an invisible force, and turned into blood all over the ground. You can understand it as a kind of poison. Seeing Su Li's attentive look, Black Lotus suddenly found the feeling of being a teacher in those days. He put his hands on his hips and raised his head. This poison is not refined from ordinary poisons, but gathered from all the negative thoughts, such as resentment, hatred, anger, and so on. Mortals will die if they touch it, and ordinary practitioners will die if they encounter it. Speaking of this, Black Lotus turned his eyes. His eyes seemed to penetrate the black mist, and saw Wen Hun, who was fighting hard in the mist. The boy you like is not ordinary. It is worthwhile that you put medicine in his 3 meals every day to improve his physical body. Su Li pursed her lips, and a trace of pride appeared in her eyes. Has my eyesight ever been bad? Black Lotus rolled his eyes and said angrily, hurry up and eat this ghost. If we delay any longer, that kid will be corroded by the ghost. Su Li's eyes slightly condensed, and the pure ghost energy flowed. The shadow behind her instantly sprang out and grew to a size of 30 meters against the wind. It opened its mouth, which was half the size of a person's body, and bit off half of the blood-red body of the giant snake. Hiss! The black mist rolled violently, and Wen Hun, who was exhausted, suddenly faced a formidable enemy. But he did not hear the deep fear in the crazy roar. Good. Delicious, the evil ghost's instinctive thought came intermittently, and then its body continued to expand. It wanted to eat the upper body of the giant snake. But the giant snake rushed into the deep mountain and disappeared without saying a word. The evil ghost was not willing to let it go, and directly flew to the deep mountain to chase it. But when it flew to the boundary of the deep mountain, it hit an extremely hard and transparent wall. Boom! Lightning flashed and thunder roared, and the earth shook. What's the matter? It's an earthquake. Come out of the house. The disciples in the residence at the foot of the mountain were suddenly shocked, and were in a mess. Wen Hun looked at the dark clouds that suddenly dispersed in the sky, and was at a loss. Then he saw Su Li, who was also at a loss, standing not far from him. Little junior sister apprentice. He was burning with anxiety. He rushed to Su Li quickly, grasped Su Li's arms tightly, and stared at her face nervously. Junior sister apprentice. Junior sister apprentice. The little girl came to her senses, turned her eyes in confusion, and asked crisply, Senior fellow apprentice, what's wrong with you? Hearing this normal sentence, Wen Hun was relieved, and a bright smile appeared on his pale face. Then he fell down in front of Su Li. This boy is exhausted. It's hard for him to worry about you, old witch. Black Lotus rushed out. Su Li held Wen Hun and slowly put him on the ground. Then she said indifferently, I'm 18 years old this year. Black Lotus, unconsciously, it has been more than 4 years since I was reborn. Time flies so fast. Su Li muttered to herself. She spread out her palms and saw the scorched marks on her palms. A look of thinking flashed in her eyes. Is it the fire of extreme young? The evil ghost hit the barrier and was slightly injured. Her body would also be affected a little, but it was just a skin injury. After all, even if the evil ghost exploded, she could recover after a few months of rest. Suddenly, Su Li's ears moved slightly. Then she loosened her body and fell beside Wen Hun. After a few breaths, the woman in black flew over with a still cold face. As soon as she landed, she looked serious. She slightly opened her 5 fingers, and the white nails flashed with cold light, stabbing at Su Li's throat lying on the ground. Su Li didn't move, but the woman in black moved faster. The killing intent in her eyes almost condensed into a substance. Swish! The chilly wind blew over. The white and sharp nails stopped on the snow-white skin of Su Li's neck. After a pause, they finally retracted. The woman in black straightened up and narrowed her eyes. Seeing the disciples of the sect in a mess at the foot of the mountain, she bent down to pick up Su Li and Wen Hun with both hands, and flew to their residence. 3 days later, Wen Hun woke up slowly. When he saw the ceiling of his room, the last scene before he fainted flashed in his eyes. Suddenly, he couldn't lie down anymore. With a splitting headache, he got up from the bed and stumbled to the door. But he saw Su Li coming to him. Senior fellow apprentice. The girl was stunned. She stepped forward to support the tottering Wen Hun with surprise and joy, and dragged him to the room. Senior fellow apprentice, it's great that you wake up. Senior sister apprentice, you said that you can't get up yet. After you wake up, you have to lie down and recuperate. I'm not so fragile. Wen Hun smiled. Suddenly, he froze and said nervously, Did senior sister apprentice you speak? The girl shook her head, and pointed to the paper full of handwriting on the table. Senior sister apprentice, you went to guard the hall for you. Wen Hun breathed a sigh of relief. The master had secretly told him that if senior sister apprentice you spoke one day, he should immediately activate the tactical matrix of the sect and kill her. At that time, he was young and didn't understand it. Now, after experiencing all kinds of weird things, he understood that the master's instruction must have something to do with those ghosts. Since senior sister apprentice you guards the hall in person, She can definitely wait for the master's return with peace of mind. Wen-hun sat back on the bed and looked a little relaxed. His face was even a little ruddy that he couldn't see. He felt a little strange. He had been to the deep mountain and fought with those ghosts. Every time he overdrew that power, he would feel pain all over his body for a few days. His headache was much worse than now, which was worse than death. But this time, the overdrawing was obviously much more severe than the previous times, and the feeling of physical feedback was not so serious. Could it be that the master said the erosion period has already appeared? Wen-hun's face was slightly pale, and his hands clenched subconsciously. He was only 98 years old. No, the master clearly said that the erosion period would only appear after 200 years old. Senior fellow apprentice, what's wrong with you? You look so pale. Su Li said. She was also puzzled in her heart. She kindly treated this guy, but he looked solemn as if he was about to die. Wen-hun came to his sense, and waved his hands repeatedly, nothing. Maybe I'm too tired. Seeing that he didn't tell the truth, Su Li didn't insist, and let him have a good rest. Returning to the adytum in her house, Su Li took out bottles and jars from the universe ring, and frowned slightly. Is there something wrong with the medicine I refined? But the boy's body does recover well. Forget it. Let's continue first, and then adjust it. 3 days later, Wen-hun was completely healed, but his expression became more and more solemn. Every time he stayed with Su Li, he would be in a daze from time to time. No one knew what he was thinking. Although there were many cracks on some mountains of the sect because of the collision of Su Li and the evil ghost, fortunately, the big tactical matrix of the sect repaired itself, and the disturbance soon subsided. After Wen-hun was completely healed, he returned to the hall of the sect. Senior sister apprentice, you returned to the deep mountain. Her expression when she left seemed to be very anxious. After her figure completely disappeared in the deep mountain, Su Li touched her neck. She didn't forget the situation that day. Her intuition wouldn't be wrong. Senior sister apprentice, you really wanted to kill her at that moment, but she didn't know why she stopped. In the boring waiting, another few days passed. Wen-hun completed a certain transformation in these days. His expression changed from solemn and uneasy to calm. Junior sister apprentice. The setting sun was about to fall into the mountain, and the light was like blood. The cold wind blew, bringing a little snow. Su Li patted the snow on her shoulder, and turned her head with a puzzled look. Senior fellow apprentice, what's wrong? Wen-hun showed a gentle smile, as when they met for the first time, you should keep what I said today in mind. Su Li frowned when she heard the words, which seemed to be a funeral. Senior fellow apprentice, what's wrong with you? If you have anything to say, just say it. I will bear it with you. Wen-hun couldn't help laughing bitterly. Listen, master looks kind, but if it is really a critical moment, he can give up everything. You don't trust him too much. Su Li was stunned, and blurted out, why? Master is obviously very. That's all an illusion. Wen-hun interrupted her, and touched his cold chest. If I weren't a little special, he wouldn't teach me carefully. At this moment, Wen-hun suddenly transmitted the sound from speaking. The immortal cultivation sect, as its name suggests, raises a god, a ghost. Chapter 520. Although I haven't been in the sect for a long time, fortunately, the master always takes me with him. He doesn't tell me many things, but I can guess most of them under the influence of what I see and hear. After saying the word immortal of ghost, Wen-hun seemed to open the shackles in his heart. While walking back to the mountain road with Su Li, he instilled all his speculations to Su Li. The immortal nourishing tactics of the sect is divided into 2 chapters. One is human chapter, and the other is ghost chapter. A long time ago, the immortal nourishing tactics should be divided into 2 factions, human chapter and ghost chapter. Master didn't lie half a month ago at the square. The inheritance of the nourishing spirit art is indeed incomplete, and only the first 3 stages are left. However, he left some leeway in his words. Only the human chapter is missing, while the ghost chapter is complete. Hearing that, Su Li stretched out her hand and pointed out a nimbus in the nothingness. Wen Hun felt a little uncomfortable when he sensed the nimbus, but he still nodded with appreciation. The second hurdle of human chapter has caught up with your cultivation. It seems that you haven't been lazy during this period. Senior fellow apprentice, since the practice method of human chapter is incomplete, why doesn't the master impart ghost chapter? Su Li heard a clue and followed Wen Hun's words. Wen Hun looked gloomy suddenly. After a moment of silence, he continued to transmit the sound in silence. His voice was slightly perturbed and heavy. Since it is ghost chapter, only the real ghost can practice it. If a living person practices it forcibly, he will only become a lunatic who is neither a human nor a ghost. Wen Hun paused, as if he was accumulating courage. Then he seemed to figure something out. He barely maintained a smile and said, "I practice ghost chapter." Wen Hun stopped, and the wind seemed to be stagnant at this moment. Su Li turned her eyes, and her face was full of curiosity. Her bright eyes were like the sunshine in a dark room. She was not afraid at all. "Senior fellow apprentice, are you a ghost?" Wen Hun was stunned, and then nodded bitterly. Since ancient times, it is difficult for a malicious ghost to enter the reincarnation, but I am the reincarnation of a malicious ghost. I am born half human and half ghost, so, the master accepts me. Su Li's eyes brightened, and she exclaimed, "Senior fellow apprentice, you are so awesome. We can't practice the ghost chapter." Hearing this, Wen Hun's eyes widened slightly, and he fell into a sluggish state again. He was even at a loss. He had imagined the reaction of the little junior sister apprentice when she heard this, but he didn't expect that the little girl didn't play according to common sense. "Junior sister, I'm telling the truth." Wen Hun was impatient. His snow-white clothes suddenly turned light red from the corner of his clothes. A red-clothed evil ghost. This kid is really the reincarnation of an evil ghost. How rare. Black Lotus's exclamation came to her ears. Su Li turned her eyes and held Wen Hun's cheeks with her warm hands. Wen Hun's eyes widened, and he froze on the spot as if he was immobilized. The blood on the hem of his clothes faded away like a tide, and then gathered on his face. "Senior brother, your face is so red and hot. Are you still injured?" Su Li blinked her eyes, and showed a trace of worry just in time. Wen Hun came to his sense with a start, and hurriedly stepped aside. He, who was in Yuanying realm, was unsteady on his feet, and almost fell down. "Master, you are not a child anymore. When can you change your temper of teasing people?" Black Lotus looked at Wen Hun, whose face was as red as the bottom of a hot pot with pity. He sighed. "Another poor child. Junior sister apprentice, what I said is true. Don't take it as a joke. There are many ghosts in the book pavilion, the isolation tower and the deep mountain who are possessed by the devil after practicing the ghost chapter. When you see them, you must pretend not to see them, and don't talk to them. Besides, if the master gives you the practice method of the ghost chapter, you must not practice it. You should pretend not to know it, so that you can be safe. Junior sister apprentice, don't run away. Senior fellow apprentice, I remember what you said. It's getting dark, and I have to cook." Seeing Su Li go away, Wen Hun sighed faintly. Forget it. Junior sister apprentice was still young. Even if he had entered the erosion period, it was not a problem to hold on for a few years. He still had time. After a sumptuous dinner, Wen Hun sensed that his physical body had fully recovered, and left with a heavy face. Su Li watched him go away, and closed the door of the courtyard. There was a hint of enlightenment in her eyes. Wen Hun is anxious to tell me these things, because he sensed that he was in danger. Since the ghost chapter can only be practiced by real ghosts, and this boy is just a half-ghost, there must be side effects. My medicine misled him to think that the side effects began. After figuring it out, Su Li smiled slightly, and returned to the additum to absorb the power of the soul in the meat for dinner. In the middle of the night, the whole immortal cultivation sect fell into a dead silence. In the night of the immortal cultivation sect, no disciple was allowed to leave the residence. This had become a tradition in the immortal cultivation sect, which had never been changed for thousands of years. Those disciples who had once tried to test the method had all vanished from the face of the earth, and there was no exception. At this moment, the moon was in the middle of the sky. Su Li raised her head and glanced at the crescent moon hanging in the sky. She narrowed her eyes slightly, and gently pushed open the door of the book pavilion. The two doors slid inward silently. At this moment, all the sounds disappeared. There was no light in the dark and empty door, like a huge mouth to devour people. Su Li's expression remained unchanged. As soon as she stepped into the book pavilion, the two doors suddenly closed fiercely, but strangely, there was no sound. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The candlelight on the wall suddenly lit up automatically, and the entire hall on the first floor was brightly lit. But Su Li felt that the lit flame revealed a cold atmosphere. It's so late, but someone still comes to the book pavilion. He is really hard-working. An old voice came. Su Li looked in the direction of the voice, and saw an old servant in grey sweeping the floor, holding an oil lamp, coming out from behind a bookshelf with a kind smile on his face. When Su Li saw him, she somehow thought of He-Ju. This kind smile seemed to come from the same mold. Or maybe, the ghost in front of her deliberately imitated He-Ju's smile. Su Li didn't speak and ignored the existence of the old servant. She walked to the bookshelf and walked to the place where the essays was placed according to her memory. Sure enough, she saw the familiar booklet. She reached out to pick it up and opened it casually. Suddenly, she saw the ending of the first story. It turns out that the woman in the mountain does not live alone in the deep mountain. There is an old woman and a half-grown girl in the house. Although the life in the mountain is hard, it is happy and quiet. The scholar lived peacefully with them for a night, and suddenly felt that he was not good at seeking fame. He decided to abandon secular distractions and stay in the deep mountain to practice hard forever. Seeing this, Su Li closed the booklet directly, and a trace of sarcasm flashed in her eyes. Every word in this book was distorted, revealing a strong sense of falsehood. Even if she didn't meet the ghost who pretended to be Wen Hun that day, she wouldn't believe this childish ending. You don't seem to be satisfied with the ending. The old servant who swept the floor came to Su Li at some time. He didn't look at the booklet, but at his toes. His voice changed slightly. Su Li suddenly turned around with her back to the old servant. But she just avoided the sharp claws of the old servant. She scanned the booklets on the bookshelf with her divine awareness. Suddenly, she came to the bookshelf and picked up a black booklet, Ghost Chapter. I remember that it is the human chapter that was put here during the day. Interesting. This thought flashed through Su Li's mind. She tried hard to open the black booklet, but she couldn't open it. It seemed that the inner pages of the booklet were all glued together and couldn't be opened at all. Junior sister apprentice. A figure flashed beside Su Li, and a woman in cyan with disheveled hair appeared. The woman in cyan had a pale face, but she was still delicate. Only a pair of dead fish eyes ruined the beauty. She stood on tiptoe and stared at Su Li's face. Her voice was as sharp as a night owl, almost piercing the eardrum. You don't have the divine token to practice this method. Put it back. Divine token? Su Li tilted her head and smiled. She put the black booklet in her arms, and her eyes fell on the woman in cyan. What is the divine token? Before her voice died away, the delicate face of the woman in cyan immediately became ferocious. Her clothes were stained like blood, and her hair grew wildly. After a few breaths, her hair became a huge black wave, and Su Li was submerged in it. He. Ignorant human, answer me. You are my sacrifice. The grey-clothed old servant turned into a wisp of smoke in awe and threw himself into the oil lamp on the bookshelf. Then his head popped out and licked his lips unwillingly. Poor human clan, they even attracted a ferocious ghost. No one came to the book pavilion to die for a long time at night. He wanted to have some fun, but, boom, there was a sudden loud noise in the black hair, and countless broken hairs turned into black dust falling all over the sky. The oil lamp shook, and the frightened eyes of the grey-clothed old servant were illuminated. Su Li, who was integrated with the evil ghost, wiped the corners of her mouth. Her dark and deep eyes suddenly turned to look at the oil lamp, as if she was looking at an extremely delicious food. After awakening the fusion talent, it is the first time for me to use it. It turns out that the 5 senses of the evil ghost are very different from mine. If it is the original body, it will definitely not feel that the ferocious ghost is delicious. Thinking of this, Su Li picked up the shivering body of the grey-clothed old servant, the oil lamp. She chuckled, "Answer my question obediently, or I will eat you." The grey-clothed old servant wanted to cry, but had no tears. His body trembled more violently. Who was the ghost? The book pavilion at night was cool. Frogs croaked outside the window from time to time. It was quiet and harmonious. In such harmony, Su Li held the oil lamp that was burning strongly in the wind and whispered, "I really only know so much. Don't look at me like this. In fact, I am just a little ghost with 300 years of cultivation. If you want to know the truth of this sect, ask those ferocious ghosts in red. They must know." The grey-clothed old servant was frightened and almost cried and pretended to be pitiful. "But you also saw that after I ate the kind senior sister apprentice, no one else came out. You see, even the book pavilion has returned to normal. Things are not easy to deal with." Su Li showed a trace of chagrin. It seemed that she was regretting that she ate too early, which made the grey-clothed old servant break into a cold sweat. "Grandpa, what should I do? I am going back to make breakfast for my senior fellow apprentice before dawn." Chapter 521. The oil lamp kept struggling, trying to escape from Su Li's control. But his efforts were not effective. Instead, he sensed that the two small hands grasping him gradually exerted force, and the old oil lamp suddenly made a sound of being overwhelmed. The grey-clothed old servant suddenly panicked. If the oil lamp was broken, he would also disappear. His life was hanging by a thread, and he immediately forgot the rules of the book pavilion. Mercy. Mercy. This old servant remembers now. You go to the second floor. The information on the second floor is not connected with the first floor. There are many ghosts in red there, and they are all old ghosts who have lived for many years. As soon as the words came out, Su Li loosened her hands and threw the oil lamp into the Kang Lei's cave. "If what you said is false, I will crush you and make medicine." The grey-clothed old servant looked at the cave and heard the words. How could he not know what kind of existence he had encountered? He could only sigh repeatedly and admit his bad luck. Fortunately, what he said just now was all true. Su Li did not hesitate and directly went up the stairs to the second floor. When she stepped on the soft carpet on the second floor, she felt a gust of chilly wind blowing on her face. All she could see was mist, and the chilly breath was several times stronger than the first floor. In such a dead space, as soon as the breath belonging to a living person appeared, it was like a lamp in the darkness, and immediately attracted the attention of all ghosts. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Pairs of blood-red eyes lit up, and their eyes were full of crazy appetite. How long had they not eaten meat? Su Li did not move, and slowly walked to the bookshelf, as if she did not see those malicious ghosts at all. The footsteps were extremely harsh in the dead space. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Many malicious ghosts in red were killed. More than a dozen red lights lit up from the darkness. Su Li glanced at them roughly and found there were more than 20 bloody eyes. Every time she took a step, those bloody eyes would get closer, and some strange appearances were revealed from the darkness. Among them, there were humans, beasts, and odd monsters. Their faces were extremely distorted, and they all stared at every part of Su Li's body. If an ordinary practitioner came to this step, he would have been frozen to death by the chilly breath that escaped from the malicious ghosts. Pa. Suddenly, Su Li stopped. With a smile in her eyes, she looked around at the ferocious ghosts who were less than 3 meters away from her and said sweetly, 24. Who is the oldest? The atmosphere froze in that instant, and then all the evil spirits' blood-red bodies exploded. They opened their mouths full of fangs at lightning speed, ferociously and crazily biting the only living person on the scene. But this time, their food did not have the usual look of fear on its face. Instead, it had a strange smile on its face. Then, a bloody mouth that was larger than all 24 of them combined opened up from within the pitch-black shadow. All the malicious spirits stared at this scene with their mouths agape. Before they could even dodge, They were all swallowed by the bloody mouth. Whoosh, the second floor also returned to normal. When the grey-robed old servant in Kang Lei's cave saw this scene, his body trembled even more violently, and there were even a few cracks on the lamp body. The 24 red spectres on the second level are all lords who have cultivated for thousands of years, but they've all been eaten. In the moonlight, Su Li's shadow trembled for a while, and then calmed down. Su Li looked up at the third floor. She was a little unsatisfied, but finally went downstairs and left. The evil ghosts had eaten enough tonight, and they needed time to digest it. The next morning, Wen Hun woke up from meditation and came to Su Li's yard for breakfast as usual. "Senior fellow apprentice, I made a new lean meat porridge today. Come and have a taste." Seeing the familiar smile of his junior sister apprentice, Wen Hun felt a little relieved. He walked to the table and sat down. When he was about to pick up the spoon, he suddenly felt something and looked out of the room. He didn't know when senior sister apprentice Yu in black stood at the door, looking at him coldly. Wen Hun was slightly shocked. Why did senior sister apprentice Yu come out from the deep mountain at this time? Senior sister apprentice? Wen Hun stood up. The woman in black took a deep look at him and motioned him to keep up. Then she flew to the book pavilion. Did something happen in the book pavilion this time? Wen Hun's heart sank, and he immediately put down his chopsticks to keep up. Sure enough, there is a connection between the book pavilion and the deep mountain. Su Li's eyes flashed, and she also flew to keep up. After a while, the three of them came to the book pavilion. Several disciples of the sect were waiting at the door. "Senior fellow apprentice Wen, you finally come." An ordinary-looking middle-aged man in Zhuji realm greeted them. He called Wen Hun, who looked like a teenager, "senior fellow apprentice," which sounded very strange. Su Li glanced at him strangely. Wen Hun smiled embarrassedly. "Don't look at me like this. If other senior fellow apprentices and senior sister apprentices don't show up, I will be the chief disciple of the sect." "Senior fellow apprentice, you are so awesome." Su Li's eyes were bright, which made Wen Hun's face hot. Fortunately, the words of the middle-aged man came in time to save the situation. "Senior fellow apprentice, go in and have a look. The book pavilion is in a mess." Wen Hun nodded with a serious look and walked into the book pavilion. Suddenly, he saw a ruin. The morning light shone down, and there was a faint smell of decay. "Senior fellow apprentice, when I and junior fellow apprentices came to light the incense in the morning, the first and second floors became like this. It seems that they have been abandoned for many years. It's very strange." Wen Hun walked to the ruins, and could vaguely see the traces of bookshelves in the ruins. He waved his hand, and a tattered miscellaneous book flew out automatically. But before it fell into his hand, it turned into flying ash and scattered. When the middle-aged disciple saw this scene, he immediately widened his eyes and said repeatedly, "That's it. All the books seem to be corroded by time and turn into ashes." Wen Hun frowned tightly. He, who knew some of the truth, certainly saw it more deeply than the middle-aged disciple. "Senior fellow apprentice, why does senior sister apprentice you disappear?" Su Li suddenly said. Wen Hun immediately woke up. He looked up and didn't see the figure of the woman in black. "Senior sister apprentice you?" The middle-aged disciple was slightly stunned, and immediately said, "I didn't see senior sister apprentice you. I was about to send someone to find you." "Senior fellow apprentice, you happened to come here." Wen Hun frowned more tightly. Since the master left, the sect had many misunderstandings. All kinds of evil spirits came out to make trouble. Although he didn't know whether the senior sister apprentice you just now was true, he didn't bother to investigate it since she didn't act maliciously. Thinking of this, he waved to Su Li to let Su Li follow him to the second floor. Wen Hun originally thought that the strength of ghosts on the second floor would not destroy too many bookshelves. But when he saw the empty and bare space on the second floor, he couldn't help twitching his mouth. What on earth happened here last night? Why was it worse than the first floor? All the numbers of ghosts disappeared completely. Master will come back half a month later. If he sees that the first and second floors of the book pavilion are destroyed, what will he think? Wen Hun sighed secretly and was about to go downstairs. Senior fellow apprentice, don't we go up and have a look? Su Li looked back at the second floor. A few evil ghosts hiding in the dark immediately hid in a darker place. No, we can find more clues on the first floor. Come with me. I have something to tell you. Okay, senior fellow apprentice. Wen Hun's voice came from downstairs. Su Li responded crisply and walked downstairs cheerfully. At the moment when she went downstairs, she could faintly hear a group of little ghosts breathing with relief. The book pavilion is the hiding place of many ghosts. The power of ghosts in these books is all extracted, so it becomes what it is now. Wen Hun spread out a book of essays and transmitted the sound to guide Su Li, and I can barely keep it from dispersing with the power of Ghost Chapter. Look through it and see if there is an ending to the story in it. Su Li opened it according to his words, and immediately saw the ending of the first story. She read it out. Deep in the desolate and uninhabited mountains, there are countless wild spirits and monsters. How could weak women survive alone? They were just mortals who were killed while passing through this place. After they died, they were unwilling to become evil spirits, so they lured the living to become their food. The scholar didn't know that after being eaten by the 3 female ghosts, not even his soul was left behind. The ending of the story not only appeared, but also talked about the story of human and ghost without any taboo. Sure enough, the ghosts on the first and second floor of the book pavilion have all left. Wen Hun's face was a little gloomy. Those ghosts would not step out of the book pavilion for thousands of years, and they only moved at night. Why did they suddenly violate the agreement and leave? He didn't think those things would be destroyed. As far as he knew, no one could defeat those ghosts. Even the master would only compromise with them, make unfair deals one after another, and even let those things devour the disciples of the sect. The immortal cultivation sect was a fragile shell wrapped around the ghosts. It was okay for the ghosts to sleep. If they completely woke up one day, no one could survive. The human clan was too fragile. Wen Hun clenched his fists and looked up at the ignorant junior sister apprentice. He took a deep breath and dismissed the other disciples. Then he walked to the 2 stone lions in front of the gate of the book pavilion and stood still. Come out. I'm Wen Hun. I have something to ask you. As soon as the words came out, the 2 stone lions suddenly shook. Su Li's eyes narrowed. The pneuma of these 2 ghosts was so weak that she could hardly perceive it. Last night, the pneuma of the malicious ghost in red was too strong, so she didn't perceive it. However, she just stood here. Su Li's eyes flickered, and there was a trace of playfulness in her eyes. The 2 stone lions suddenly shook more violently, but they didn't dare to pretend to be dead. They could only show 2 bitter faces. When one of the human-faced lions was about to speak, it heard Su Li's sound transmission. If you dare to expose me, I will eat you. The stone lion stared at her and almost bit his tongue. He immediately swallowed the words in his mouth and changed his words. Lord Wen Hun, what do you want to ask? Wen Hun was stunned, and a strange expression appeared in his eyes. Although the 2 stone lions were extremely weak ghosts, every time they talked to him, they always raised their noses and wanted to step on his head. Why were they so humble this time? Did the master win back a little face for us this time? Wen Hun was puzzled, but he didn't care much about the matter of the book pavilion. He said in a low voice, "What happened in the book pavilion last night? Tell me everything you saw." The twisted face of the stone lion paused for a moment, and then seemed to be instructed by something. He immediately said, Lord Wen Hun, the ghosts in red on the first and second floor were all dead last night. Chapter 522. Dead. Wen Hun's mature face was suddenly full of shock. He widened his eyes. Perhaps the respect of the stone lion gave him great courage. He finally asked the answer he had always wanted to know, you ghosts will also die? Ghosts don't belong to the 5 elements and don't enter reincarnation, but they will also die. Just like weak ghosts like us, if we don't have a powerful backer to protect us, we'll be devoured by even more powerful ghosts not long after we gain consciousness. Wen Hun was surprised and continued to ask, What kind of ghost can be regarded as a backer? Of course, it's the red-clothed senior. But you just said that the red-clothed senior are all dead. That is the ghost that is more powerful than the red-clothed senior. Even those lords can only be reduced to food, as he said. The stone lion secretly peeped at Su Li. Seeing that Su Li didn't respond, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. If it could sweat, its body would have been soaked with cold sweat at this moment. When Wen Hun heard this, he suddenly felt a sense of horror. The ghost that was more powerful than the ferocious ghost in red. Did it refer to the immortal of ghost worshipped by the master? The master went for the immortal of ghost this time. Now the immortal of ghost wreaked havoc in the sect. What did it mean? Would the master come back after a month? Wen Hun was shocked, and his face changed. Su Li was a little helpless. What was this silly boy imagining again? Well, I will keep the third floor of the book pavilion first. I will find out the relationship between the book pavilion and the deep mountain first, and then make a plan. It happens that there is one difficult to digest among the red-clothed senior. During the day, Su Li followed Wen Hun to guard the hall. She was warned by Wen Hun not to leave the yard at night. After dinner, Wen Hun left in the dusk. When it was completely dark, Su Li closed the door of the yard and returned to the adytum. Crack! The shadow shuddered and a drenched red-clothed girl was flung out. The red-clothed girl struggled on the ground for a moment before she managed to sit up. On her pale face, tears of blood flowed from her pitch-black, pupilless eyes, down her neck and body. Soon, a pool of blood was formed on the ground. Su Li faced her. Against the candlelight, the atmosphere gradually became gloomy and horrible. "Don't dirty my adytum," Su Li suddenly said softly and broke the silence. The red-clothed girl was stunned for a moment, and then her tears of blood flowed even faster. However, when they reached her feet, the girl sucked them back with great effort. The pool of blood on the ground also gradually shrank and disappeared. "Good girl." Su Li smiled gently and held the little face of the porcelain doll in her hands. The girl in red suddenly trembled more violently. "What's your name?" The red-clothed girl opened her blood-red mouth and spoke carefully. Her voice seemed to come from countless men and women, chaotic and sharp. This kind of eerie voice should have made people feel fear, but at this moment, the voice revealed a strong sense of begging for mercy. I am Hong Baizhu. Don't eat me." Su Li smiled slightly and let go of her palm. She said in a casual tone, "It depends on whether you are obedient or not. Your companions are so ugly that I can't help but want to destroy them. But you are different. Although your eyes are not very good, your face is very beautiful." The red-dressed girl blushed and touched her face. Feeling somewhat embarrassed, she stammered, Is that so? Those are not my companions, and they always compete with me for food." Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly, and her tone was still gentle. "How many people have you eaten?" The dark eyes of the red-dressed girl were full of confusion. What are people?" Su Li chuckled and pointed outside. "Those living creatures outside who can move and go back to your place to read during the day." The red-dressed girl suddenly understood and immediately shook her head. She touched her dry belly, and a trace of curiosity appeared in her dark eyes. I haven't eaten them. Are they delicious?" "You haven't eaten them?" Su Li's first thought was that she was lying, and her eyes were slightly cold. The red-dressed girl suddenly panicked and hurriedly explained while stammering, "I really haven't eaten them. I just woke up. They always lie to me. I have been cheated several times." Su Li looked at the red-dressed girl thoughtfully, as if she was thinking about the authenticity of this sentence. The red-dressed girl was extremely scared and continued to stammer, I am different from them. They all eat too much, and become like me. I was born. I slept for a long time, and when I woke up, I couldn't defeat them." She seldom spoke and spoke intermittently, but Su Li still understood her. "Are you nobler than them?" Su Li slightly raised her lips and touched the soft black hair of the red-dressed girl. The girl was scared and wanted to cover her head, but she failed. "You slept for a long time, so it seems that you don't know the origin of the immortal cultivation sect. I didn't expect that the one who is the most difficult to digest is the most useless. As soon as the words came out, more bloody tears appeared in the eyes of the red-dressed girl. They almost overflowed her eyes and flowed down her cheeks. I'm so scared. I don't want to be eaten. I don't feel good sleeping. The strong sense of fear stimulated the black eyes of the red-dressed girl to burst out a little white light. Then it seemed that she was suddenly enlightened, and the memory before she fell asleep flashed back for a moment. Although it was only for a moment, it was enough for the red-dressed girl to remember a lot. The red-dressed girl froze for a moment and suddenly became happy. I know. She knew that she didn't need to sleep. The red-dressed girl's idea was too simple. Before Su Li continued to ask questions, she impatiently stretched out her fleshy and bloodless cold little hand and pointed at the center of Su Li's eyebrows. She shared her poor memory with Su Li. In an instant, a clear picture flashed through Su Li's awareness sea. Under the dark sky, the familiar mountaintop of the immortal cultivation sect came into view. However, there were too many disciples of the immortal cultivation sect. There were tens of thousands of them. There were dense pavilions in the mountain range, and even the area in the deep mountain was included in it. How many years ago is this picture? Su Li's heart skipped a beat, and the picture in her mind accelerated. Soon, she saw a figure like Hong Baizhu standing in the air, and the human clan of the immortal cultivation sect were all shivering under her feet. The woman was slim and beautiful. 2 lines of symbolic bloody tears were dotted under her eyelids, like 2 rubies, which made her more enchanting. Is this the former Hong Baizhu? Su Li was surprised. The scene in front of Hong Baizhu in her memory was revealed. There were 2 ghosts like mountains of flesh. The pale flesh all over their body was like rocks, which were squeezed together in an extremely chaotic manner. The word ugly was not enough to describe the appearance of the 2 ghosts. Ha ha ha, Hong Baizhu, you are a ghost lord, but you can't even control your subordinates. Today, we will accept your yin gathering place. A hoarse, crazy, and childish voice came from the mountain of flesh on the left, which made Su Li couldn't help but pick her ears. Was the voice of the ghost cut into pieces by the natural law? It was very unpleasant to hear. In contrast, the voice of Hong Baizhu could be regarded as the sound of nature. In the picture, Hong Baizhu's pretty face was full of anger. She snorted softly, and the familiar voice without childishness sounded, "Even if I am alone, I will not be bullied by a group of trash like you. Get out of here." After saying that, she stretched out her hand and grasped with her 5 fingers. A blood-red umbrella appeared in her palm out of thin air. The top of the umbrella floated, and 2 huge red cold lights flew out. The 2 mountains of flesh laughed strangely at the same time, and raised a flesh shield that was constantly screaming. The 2 cold lights flew over and directly sank into the flesh shield. Then the flesh shield's scream became louder. When Hong Baizhu saw this shield, her pupils suddenly shrank. The wall of evil ghosts is actually here. Aren't you afraid of the Ghost Emperor's blame? Ha ha ha, the Ghost Emperor? He can't even protect himself now. After eating you, I will be the master here. The 2 mountains of flesh laughed wildly. Suddenly, they wriggled and merged together. The huge shield instantly extended countless times, including the entire immortal cultivation sect. The body of the descendant of the Ghost Emperor. I really can't wait. Ha 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 ha. Hong Baizhu looked cold and solemn. She was in a desperate situation, but she didn't panic. Instead, she showed a determined look. 2 blood tears fell down from her eyelids, and the blood tears that had stopped flowing immediately flowed down. Even if I fall into an endless sleep, I will never let you succeed. Then, the picture turned into a white light, and then dimmed down. Hong Baizhu, who looked like a little girl, had her eyes shining. It turned out that she was so powerful before, but now she was going to be eaten. As she thought about it, more blood tears flowed down, and then she hurriedly sucked back all the blood on the ground. Although she was still Hong Baizhu, her consciousness was reborn. Although fragments of memory flashed back occasionally, they couldn't replace her current consciousness. Black Lotus, when are you able to see through this memory? Su Li transmitted her thoughts into Black Lotus Ring. Tut tut, in the era of ghosts, There was even the Ghost Emperor. In addition, it is not difficult to guess that it is the All Spirits era, which is even older than Kueyu Palace in terms of history. It seems that sometimes rumors can be believed. The immortal cultivation sect has existed for at least tens of thousands of years, or even longer. After all, the history of the All Spirits era is so long that no one knows how long that era lasted. Su Li looked at Hong Baizhu, who was still crying, and felt a little strange. In other words, she almost ate an old monster who lived in the All Spirits era. Fortunately, this Hong Baizhu seems to be the descendant of the Ghost Emperor, and it is difficult for me to digest her. Otherwise, it will be a big loss. Su Li thought, and suddenly pointed to the direction of the deep mountain outside the house. Sense it. How is the strongest existence inside compared to you in your heyday? Suddenly asked, Hong Baizhu forgot to cry, and began to sense the same kind instinctively in a daze. Her bloodline was unusual, and she soon got the result. It is very strange, very weak, and I don't know it. Now I am weaker than that thing. I can't defeat it. Su Li nodded gently. In this way, with the memory of Hong Baizhu, she finally got some ideas. After sleeping for so many years, you lost your memory, and your nest was occupied by some unknown little ghost. Su Li's eyes were shining, and she gently touched Hong Baizhu's smooth and soft hair. Inexplicably, I picked up a treasure. Is it because of my identity as the daughter of luck? Chapter 523. 34 Chinese Language Network, Wonderful Pop-Up Window Free Reading, Su Li's doubts. No one could tell her the answer. She didn't dwell on it and continued to ask, what is the yin gathering place used for? Hong Baizhu tilted her head and recalled for a while. She pointed to the door and said, I feed them and protect their yin energy. I eat enough. Su Li nodded and whispered, so, in your time, the human clan and you depended on each other and were food for each other. Time. Hong Baizhu's eyes were full of confusion. She couldn't understand many words that Su Li said, but she could instinctively feel that the existence in front of her was very disgusted with eating people. So, she continued, those weak ones, as long as they are alive, have yin energy. I don't eat them. Su Li smiled slightly. The smile was so gentle that the little girl was a little dazzled. I don't dislike you eating people, as long as you don't eat innocent people. There are many cultivators in the cultivation world who seek death. I have yet to see a cultivator who doesn't deserve to die. Hong Baizhu was stunned. Then, you, Su Li squinted and said softly. I also deserve to die, but I am not reconciled, so. I can't die. The little girl didn't understand. She sat aside and tried to keep the blood and tears from staining the ground. She was silent. Su Li took out a piece of palm-sized flesh. The little girl sniffed it and suddenly opened her eyes. She looked up at Su Li's palm. Her eyes seemed to be shining. She said instinctively, Insi, flesh and blood. What is Insi? The little girl was stunned again. Her little face wrinkled and she was distressed. Insi, what is Insi? She didn't remember. She only knew it was a good thing. Su Li no longer forced her. Kang Lei's cave was a practitioner's cave. It couldn't trap her, so she put it into Black Lotus Ring and dealt with it later. It's better to see it with my own eyes. Su Li pushed the door open. The glimmer of the morning shone through the window with a rare warmth. But I can't destroy the seal outside the deep mountain rashly. Otherwise, the vibration alone will destroy the entire immortal cultivation sect. Su Li didn't think of a good way for a while. Junior sister apprentice. At this moment, Wen Hun's shout came from outside. Su Li immediately restrained the expression on her face and went out. As usual, Su Li and Wen Hun sat in front of the steps of the hall. Maybe it was because of swallowing too many ghosts, the perception of evil ghost was much clearer than before. If Su Li, who could not see anything before, transferred her consciousness to evil ghost, she could see the dark veins crisscrossing like blood vessels in the depths of the hall. All the veins were concentrated in a huge shadow directly below the hall. It looked like a heart, in which the pure black yin qi flowed slowly and beat very slowly. If you did not sense it carefully, you would think it was dead. A living heart. Is this what the immortal cultivation sect guards? She tilted her head and glanced at Wen Hun, who was in a trance. On that day, the bloody snake made trouble. The silly boy's first thought was to take me to the palace. That is to say, the thing under the ground is opposite to the thing in the deep mountain. But it seems that the silly boy is not willing to trigger the existence under the ground unless it is a last resort. Thinking of this, Su Li calmed down and continued to concentrate on memorizing the looming seal of the boundary between the deep mountain and the sect. After a few more days of observation, she could be familiar with the tactical matrix. Although she could not unlock it, she could go into the deep mountain without disturbing the seal. It happens that my soul power will be accumulated to the limit in a few days, and my realm will be on the verge of breaking through. If there is no accident, there will be thunder for punishment. I have to find a secluded place to release Su Bai and let him have a good meal. Su Li was quiet and no longer asked questions. Wen Hun only thought that she finally began to believe his words, so he did not disturb her and left enough time for her. In such a quiet and harmonious daily life, another 7 days passed in the blink of an eye. In a week's time, Master will be back. Wen Hun sat beside the steps with a grey spiritual saber beside him. In these days, some little ghosts came to harass him, but they were all beheaded by him neatly. However, in the eyes of the little junior sister apprentice, he was probably like a psychopath who slashed at the air. Wen Hun sighed secretly, and turned to look at Su Li, who preferred to be in a daze rather than talking. He immediately felt that he had guessed the point. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly felt something and turned his head to look at the transparent seal wall deep in the mountain. He happened to see a familiar brown-robed old man flying over and landing in front of him with a kind smile on his face. Master. Wen Hun was overjoyed. He quickly stood up and said excitedly, "You finally come back. The sect." Ho ho, He-Ju came close and patted Wen Hun's thin shoulder. "Well done. I know what happened in the sect these days. It's a natural disorder. It's not your fault." Wen Hun was relieved and nodded gently. Then he felt strange. Didn't the master never believe in heaven? He only believed in immortal of ghosts. However, he didn't think too much, and asked with a smile, "Didn't you say it would take a month? Why in advance? I'll come back when I finish my business." He-Ju interrupted Wen Hun and waved his hand. Then he seemed to feel something and shifted his sight to Su Li, who had been staring at him. At this moment, He-Ju had an illusion that he was seen through. His face was distorted for a moment, and then returned to normal. He said solemnly, "Wen Hun, why is this girl here?" Wen Hun remembered that the master asked him to guard the hall alone. At this moment, he was caught red-handed by the master. He panicked and hurriedly stood in front of Su Li. "Master, it's my fault. I'm too lonely and bored, so I asked junior sister apprentice to accompany me. You can blame me if you want to blame someone." He-Ju snorted with a cold face. "Forget it. You too, follow me into the hall." He turned around and stepped up the steps. Wen Hun smiled bitterly and was about to pull Su Li to follow him. But he pulled Su Li to an empty space. "Wait a minute." A clear voice came. Wen Hun looked up in amazement, but found that Su Li actually stood in front of He-Ju. "When did the junior sister apprentice go there?" He-Ju frowned and looked a little angry. "Su-Yu, do you know what you are doing?" Wen Hun was a little confused, and more uneasy. He stepped forward and pulled Su Li's arm. "Junior sister apprentice, what are you doing? Why do you block the master's way?" Su Li smiled and motioned Wen Hun not to panic. Then she looked back and smiled lightly. "If you are really the master, as an apprentice, I can't block the way. But you are just a ghost. Do you deserve it?" Wen Hun suddenly trembled all over, and stared at He-Ju's angry face in surprise and doubt. But he was the master. If Su Li was a ghost, how could he not see it as a half-human and half-ghost? Besides, the junior sister apprentice didn't practice ghost chapter, so she couldn't see the ghost at all. "Why, ho-ho, I see." He-Ju was silent for a moment, and suddenly sneered. "I was wondering why the sect became so chaotic after I left for only 1 month. It turns out that you, the insidious maid, are playing tricks in the dark. The means of the NI sect are really powerful. They almost made the immortal cultivation sect fall apart. As he said, he looked at Wen Hun, whose face changed constantly. Disciple, come here. What have I taught you? No matter what happens, don't panic. Is our relationship as master and disciple less than that of a maid? Wen Hun looked at Su Li, who seemed to be a different person. His heart ached, but he still struggled and asked, Junior sister apprentice, is what the master said true? Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly, and her pupils turned into the pure black like that of the evil ghost. At that moment, He Ju was a mass of rotting flesh that kept howling. However, there was a layer of strange colorful light on the surface of the rotting flesh, which blinded Wen Hun's sight. Senior fellow apprentice, she suddenly said and looked at Wen Hun seriously, have I hurt you in the past half a month? Wen Hun was stunned, and his heart began to waver again. Although he said that the master only took a fancy to his talent and cultivated him carefully, it was not easy to give up the kindness of raising him up. But the junior sister apprentice brought him indescribable warmth and happiness in the short period of less than 2 months. Chapter 524. 34 Chinese Network. In 1 second wonderful pop-up window free reading, Wen Hun stood beside Su Li, and the grey saber appeared in his hand out of thin air. He stared at He Ju coldly. He Ju's face was rigid, like a robot that was suddenly stuck. Then, his eyeballs rolled crazily inside his eye sockets like marbles. His entire face began to shake, and pieces of human skin were shaken off like powder, revealing the layers of rotten flesh underneath. It was the first time for Wen Hun to see such a disgusting ghost. He couldn't help but retch and almost spit out the breakfast. But at this moment, he heard the clear voice of his junior sister apprentice, senior fellow apprentice, step back. He took a step back subconsciously, and immediately saw a barbed hook and sickle passing the tip of his nose. He was so scared that he broke into a cold sweat. If he didn't step back, half of his face would be cut off just now. But before he recovered from the shock, the rotten flesh suddenly swelled rapidly, burst his clothes, and turned into a mass of white flesh. In the middle of the flesh, there was a huge mouth full of sharp teeth, which was opening and closing constantly. Tut 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 tut. You spoil my plan. I will swallow you. The flesh laughed wildly, and crushed to Su Li and Wen Hun. Wen Hun's face changed dramatically, and he was about to step back. But a strong thought came from his feet, and impacted his awareness. Wen Hun's pale face suddenly turned pale. The severe pain made him even unable to think, and instinctively covered his head. No. No. Drive it away. Don't let it in, otherwise, I will die, and you will all. The roar stopped abruptly, and the pain receded like a tide. Wen Hun put down his hands, like a drowning person being lifted out of the water. He gasped violently, trying to relieve the tinnitus caused by the impact just now. He tried to open his eyes wide, and the blurred scene in front of him gradually became clear. He saw a pair of ink-black pupils, which were shedding bloody tears, occupied his whole sight. Wen Hun was so scared that his heart stopped suddenly. He swung the grey saber to chop, but was caught by a small hand. Well, don't scare him. He is more precious than you. Su Li's voice came. The small hand suddenly shrank, stepped back for 2 steps, and bowed to Wen Hun carefully. Wen Hun saw it clearly. It turned out to be a little girl who was younger than his junior sister apprentice. But the bloody tears in her eyes. Ghost! An obedient ghost! He was shocked, and everything that happened just now flashed in his mind quickly. Then, his sight couldn't help but pass Hong Baizhu and fall on Su Li. She still had that delicate and pretty face and that frail and delicate body. But now, the pitifully weak junior sister he knew had actually stepped on that huge mountain of flesh ghost and turned it into a thin sheet of paper. Was there really something wrong with the people from Ni sect? Wen Hun bit his lips tightly. He only felt bitterness in his mouth and resentment in his heart, but couldn't tell anyone. He trusted someone so unreservedly, but it was actually a lie. Senior brother, now is not the time to be distracted. Since there is something in the deep mountains pretending to be master, that means, Wen-hun was shocked. As expected, he had no time to think about Su Li's identity. He held his forehead and walked to Su Li, and asked uncomfortably, "Su Yu, what did you ask?" Hearing the change of Wen-hun's address, Su Li raised her eyebrows, and then chuckled, "I haven't been in this sect for a long time. I don't understand what he said." "Senior brother apprentice, you can interrogate." "You, don't call me senior brother." A trace of anger appeared on Wen-hun's pale face, and there was a childish grievance that couldn't be seen. Su Li couldn't help laughing. Although she couldn't empathize with Wen-hun's emotions with her state of mind, she still apologized with understanding. "Sorry, I concealed my identity, but I only concealed a name. The name is fake, but my heart is real. Do you care about me or my name?" Wen-hun couldn't find the words to refute for a while. He felt that Su Li's words were a little weird, but after thinking carefully, he found it reasonable. What did he care about? Was it just a name? As the little junior sister apprentice said, in the past more than a month, she had never been hypocritical to him. Even today, thanks to the help of the junior sister apprentice, he was saved from being killed by the ghost. "Forget it. I'm in the erosion period, and I won't live long. Don't worry about it." Thinking of this, he felt unwilling. But in the face of business, he managed to put away his emotions, took out a red jade token from his arms, and put it on the rotten meat. With a bang, the red jade token burned spontaneously, and a small area of rotten meat was scorched. The meat immediately struggled violently. Wen-hun's heart sank, and he said, "It's really a ghost in the deep mountain. If it's a ghost in the book pavilion, it won't ignite the yang token. So what should we do now?" Su Li blinked, and asked for Wen-hun's opinion. Wen-hun hesitated for a moment, and said, "I don't know what is in the deep mountain. If we can get the confession of this ghost, we may get something. It's easy." Su Li lifted her foot, reached out, and grabbed the rotten meat on the ground into a ball. Then she threw it to the little ghost, Hong Baizhu. The little girl caught it with some disgust. But in order to prove her value, she still tried to investigate the rotten meat. Then she said in a ghost's unique voice, 10 minutes, unlock the memory. Then you stay here." Su Li set a bounded domain of ghost for the little girl, and then walked into the hall with Wen-hun. "Where are we going?" Wen-hun looked back at the little girl with bloody tears who was concentrating on cracking the memory, and couldn't help asking. Su Li smiled sweetly. "Senior fellow apprentice was bullied by a bad guy just now. How can I forget it?" As she said, she stopped smiling, and stamped her feet gently. The ripples spread, and her soft voice instantly became cold. "Come out." The shadow penetrated into the ground, and turned into a sharp sword to cut off dozens of black meridians in an instant. The pure black gas gushing out from the broken meridians was absorbed by the evil ghost. The shadow in the deepest part was angry at once, and controlled the nearby black meridians to entangle the evil ghost. The hall shook violently, as if there was an earthquake. Wen-hun was horrified. He wanted to take Su Li away, but found that he couldn't move Su Li at all, and the ground around Su Li didn't shake at all. This fluctuation. Is it possible that junior sister apprentice and the immortal ghost underground fight? Wen-hun thought of what Su Li said just now, and was immediately stunned by his guess. At this moment, boom, several holes were broken on the slate in the center of the hall, and dozens of black meridians shot out like tentacles. They paused in the air for a moment, and then turned into sharp swords uniformly, stabbing toward Su Li like lightning. "Junior sister apprentice, be careful." The speed of the meridians was so fast that Wen-hun had no time to block them. At the moment when he spoke, those meridians had already arrived in front of Su Li. "Do you think I am the weakness?" Su Li narrowed her eyes, and stretched out her right hand calmly. The golden electric arc twined and flickered, and the power in her palm was released lightly. Tsuashing. A golden light as thick as a bucket burst out. Boom. Patter. Wen-hun's legs went soft, and he fell to the ground. He stared at the hall without roof and walls in shock. There was no trace of those meridians in front of him. The ground of the hall seemed to be plowed by someone. Except for the rolled soil, there was nothing left. Junior sister apprentice. What was her cultivation? Senior fellow apprentice, I accidentally damaged the master's hall. Su Li brushed her hair behind her ears in embarrassment, and her face was slightly red. When Hun came to his sense, he opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say for a moment. I don't want to, either. Su Li shook her head and sighed, it's just that I have eaten too much recently. Even I don't know what realm my strength has reached, so I can't control it properly. When Hun was silent for a moment. When he was about to say something, he suddenly saw Su Li look slightly serious. She looked behind him and said calmly, Senior fellow apprentice, come to me. When Hun felt a chill in his heart, he rushed to Su Li without saying a word, and then he dared to look back. It was unknown when a black meridian as thick as a bucket sprang out of the broken ground, and turned into an indistinct twisted shadow. The shadow was colorful, almost containing all the colors in the world, but most of them were dirty gray at first glance. Your Excellency is the Emperor in the human world. The familiar ghost voice sounded, but there was a strong fear in it. You and I mind our own business. Why do you destroy my small temple? Ho ho. Su Li chuckled softly, and said indifferently, who are you? Tell me your name. When Hun was a little confused, the ghost called the junior sister apprentice emperor. What did that mean? The master was just in Huashan realm. Above Huashan realm was nature's test, which had nothing to do with the word emperor. The twisted shadow didn't seem to hear the derogatory meaning in Su Li's words, and then responded, I am a remnant of an ancient ghost, and the ghost emperor gave me the name Hong. Emperor of human clan, you are a rare overmatch of human clan. Why do you offend the ghost emperor for a yin gathering place? Ghost emperor? Su Li tilted her head and smiled, so, you live in the all-spirits era? I heard that the ghost emperor only lives in the all-spirits era. When the twisted shadow heard this, a cold sweat came down instantly. Speaking of the ghost emperor, it's a coincidence. Su Li pointed outside the door, that little girl is called Hong Baizhu. Since you know the ghost emperor, do you know her? The twisted shadow trembled, and seemed to disperse. The atmosphere was stagnant at this moment. When Hun glanced at Su Li, and then looked up at the immortal of ghost regarded as the master by the master, he couldn't help but scratch his head. What did the junior sister apprentice say to the immortal of ghost? He didn't understand a word, but it seemed that the junior sister apprentice had the upper hand. At this moment, footsteps came from outside the hall. It was the little girl who pinched a bit of minced meat in her hand, and said with joy in her chaotic voice, It's out. When the twisted shadow saw the bloody tears in the little girl's eyes, it suddenly collapsed. It was really the legendary Hong Baizhu. The little girl held the minced meat, and was a little confused. But she still walked to Su Li, and reached out to point between Su Li's eyebrows. That memory, pass, ear to. Puff. With a sudden sound in the hall, the collapsed shadow reappeared. Chapter 525. 34 Chinese Network, in 1 second wonderful pop-up window free reading. After the smoke dissipated, the distorted shadow was gone. Instead, it was replaced by a little black pig. It was just an ordinary little black pig, which was no different from the black pigs raised by farmers. When Hun saw the thing on the ground, he felt a surge of blood and dizziness. He felt that he had been humiliated after practicing for hundreds of years. This is the immortal of ghost worshipped by the master. The little black pig on the ground stuck up its butt, walked slowly to Hong Baizhu, and knelt down like a human. Your Highness, before it finished speaking, it saw the little girl hiding behind Su Li in fear. Although she was also afraid of Su Li, at least Su Li would not eat her for the time being. And this black pig was the same kind as her. Since they were the same kind, they would eat each other. This little girl doesn't remember you. Su Li reached out and took the little girl in her arms. Her tone was smooth but indisputable, you don't have to salute. Both the immortal cultivation sect and you seem to be in a bad situation. I have nothing to do, so I am willing to help you. Now I ask and you answer. Do you hear me? The little black pig nodded hurriedly. It couldn't be better that the emperor of the human clan in front of it was willing to help. As for the consequences, it would not be worse than being swallowed by the thing in the Yin Mountain. Very well. Now I ask you, what is hidden in the deep mountain? Where did Hiju go? Seeing Wen Hun beside Su Li, the little black pig didn't dare to lie. Since the Lihan tablet was set up, Qingshui Circle has been changed. It is no longer suitable for us to live. I have consumed too much energy and am about to die. Fortunately, Ensi of the Yin Mountain transmitted the sound and was willing to help me with flesh and blood. But Ensi was sealed in the depths of the Yin Mountain, and there was a tactical matrix set by the human clan outside the Yin Mountain. I couldn't get in. In desperation, I could only make an agreement with the Immortal Cultivation Sect. They entered the mountain to help me get flesh and blood, and I gave them a little flesh and blood. But Hiju must keep the secret and not let others find out my existence. Otherwise, I would be attacked by the human clan, and this sect would also be destroyed. Hiju promised me and kept his promise to keep a low profile. The Immortal Cultivation Sect and I depended on each other. At first, we lived in harmony, but later, the little black pig's eyes darkened. It's true that humans eat the flesh and blood of Ensi to improve their souls, but, after all, humans and ghosts are different. After the excess of Ensi's flesh and blood, many disciples of the Immortal Cultivation Sect died suddenly, and new ghosts that can adapt to Qingshui Circle were born. Speaking of this, Su Li already had a guess in her heart, but she still didn't say anything and continued to listen to the little black pig. The newborn ghost was ferocious and forbearing. He possessed Hiju's first disciple and sneaked into Yin Mountain, intending to devour Ensi. However, Ensi was not easy to deal with. Even in a weak state, he sealed him with one hand. Every 100 years, Hiju would enter the mountain to perform a ritual to strengthen the seal. The new ghost hates me, Ensi, and the sect. Every time the seal is consolidated, there will be some trouble in the sect, but it has never been more fierce than this time. I recognize the rotten flesh. It is the ability of the new ghost. If I am integrated with it, I will be delirious and do irreversible things. The little black pig trembled, and fear flashed in its eyes. If you didn't happen to come to this sect, I am afraid that not only the Immortal Cultivation Sect but also the entire Jojo region will suffer a catastrophe. Su Li waved her hand and looked indifferent. She said, "How did the ghost in the book pavilion appear? You said that you made an agreement with Hiju. Hiju is only more than 3,000 years old. There are even ghosts 4 or 5,000 years old in the book pavilion. Don't tell me that they are also born by the disciples of the Immortal Cultivation Sect." The little black pig originally wanted to deceive her, but it didn't expect that Su Li even knew the age of the ghosts in the book pavilion. It shook its head and told the truth. Of course not. The book pavilion is not a book pavilion, but built by imitating the Tsangyin Tower in ancient times. The ghosts hiding in it will not be affected by Qingshui Circle. There are also many precious scripts that only ghosts can practice in it. It was not open to the disciples of the Immortal Cultivation Sect, but somehow it was opened later. Is that so? Su Li nodded gently, and light flashed in her eyes. Why don't you hide in it? Why do you have to suffer underground? The little black pig's eyes flashed, and it looked bitter. It's not that I don't want to, but that my body is too big, and the faked Tsangyin Tower can't accommodate me at all. Su Li nodded, and accepted the answer. She was silent for a moment, and asked aloud, "If I want to save the Immortal Cultivation Sect, what should I do?" "Your Excellency, you are righteous." The little black pig was excited, and bent its 2 forelegs as if it was kneeling. "If the ghosts in the Yin Mountain can be destroyed, everything can be solved. Your Excellency, please help the Immortal Cultivation Sect through the difficulties." Phew, Wen Hun breathed a sigh of relief. Hearing this, he finally understood the essence of the Immortal Cultivation Sect, and couldn't help but look at Su Li hopefully. Su Li looked back and smiled at him. Then she turned around, and her face became indifferent again. "Don't worry. I won't leave it alone even for the sake of my senior fellow apprentice. You go back and have a rest first. I will go to the Yin Mountain in a few days." Thank you, Your Excellency. The little black pig achieved its goal, so it didn't stay any longer. In the blink of an eye, its figure disappeared and returned to the depths of the ground. Senior fellow apprentice, the new ghost wants to invade again, and it won't be so fast. This hall doesn't need to be protected for the time being. Let's go back to rest first, and then go to the Yin Mountain tomorrow. Wen-hun nodded, looked around, and couldn't help sighing when he saw the Hall of the Lord was almost destroyed. Then he stepped away. After going down the main peak, Wen-hun went to appease the disciples of the sect. After all, the movement on the main peak was not small, which had attracted many people to stop and watch. Su Li returned to her residence, stood in front of her yard, and looked at the deep mountain from afar. Little Su Li, are you really going to the Yin Mountain to kill the ghosts tomorrow? Black Lotus couldn't help but rush out, and asked with a strange look. In his impression, Su Li was not a warm-hearted person. What protect the immortal cultivation sect for senior fellow apprentice? What a lie. No, that black and swarthy little piglet was a ghost, wasn't it? I must go to the Yin Mountain. Su Li chuckled. As for whether to kill the new ghost or not, she didn't say anything. Black Lotus rolled his eyes, and knew that this girl was black-hearted. She probably didn't believe a word of the little pig's words. She just wanted a legitimate chance to enter the Yin Mountain. The next morning, at the foot of the Yin Mountain, many disciples of the immortal cultivation sect were ready for battle. They knew some inside information more or less. Although they were ordinary disciples on the surface, they were deeply trusted by the Lord. After a while, Wen-hun and Su Li came together. The leading middle-aged practitioner greeted them, and said with worry, "First senior fellow apprentice, you must be careful this time. Even if you can't find the Lord, you must come back before dark." Everyone knew that after dark, there were all kinds of horrors in the Yin Mountain. Even if Wen-hun had a special physique, he might not be able to bear it, unless he found he due before dark. Wen-hun nodded. Seeing this, the middle-aged practitioner glanced at Su Li, who had just joined the sect for a short time. Although he felt strange, he didn't ask much. After all, with all kinds of horrors in the sect, curious people had died long ago. All the disciples took action. The tactical matrix of extreme yang did little harm to people, but it was not without harm. For the existence of half-human and half-ghost like Wen-hun, it must be opened before he could enter. Otherwise, he would be almost burned by the tactical matrix before he entered the Yin Mountain. 8 gates of extreme yang, open. The middle-aged cultivator shouted and waved his hands in an incantation gesture. A beam of white light shot into the spell formation, causing ripples to appear on the transparent barrier. Then, the barrier opened up from the center and turned into a small door that could allow a person to enter. Wen-hun didn't hesitate to pull Su Li into it. Swish. The small door was closed again. The middle-aged practitioner was sweating profusely. He sat on the ground and gasped. A strange smile appeared on his face, but it disappeared in an instant. Others were busy resting, so they didn't see it. Puff. The grey blade instantly cut a wolf-like ghost into 2 parts, and it turned into black smoke and dissipated. It should be just a newly formed ghost. Wen-hun took back the blade and breathed a sigh of relief. As soon as he landed, he saw a sharp mouth full of fangs. Frightened, he pulled out the blade and cut it without saying a word. Unexpectedly, the little ghost was killed by one cut. He had never killed a ghost, which showed how weak this wolf was. However, Master once said that although there were many ghosts in the Yin Mountain, it was extremely difficult to meet them. Why did we meet them as soon as we came in? He frowned and looked at Su Li beside him. The shadow behind Su Li, who was eating, immediately disappeared. She smiled. "If you want to know the answer, let's walk more." "Okay." Wen-hun nodded. Suddenly, his face became entangled again. After following Su Li for a short distance, he finally couldn't help asking, what should I call you?" Although he didn't know the true meaning of Emperor of the human race, he could guess that it was a realm that he would never be able to reach in his lifetime. Otherwise, how could a terrifying ghost that had lived for thousands or tens of thousands of years reveal its true form, speak nicely, and even have a hint of humility in it? Even if she didn't care about such a person, it was difficult for him to call her junior sister apprentice. Hearing this, Su Li smiled sweetly, and said softly, "Since you feel uncomfortable, I won't force you. Call me sister apprentice, or master." Wen Hun was shocked, and blurted out, "Master? You are the Grand Elder of Ni sect. Why? Am I famous?" Su Li looked back and blinked. Wen Hun scratched his head. "I heard from Master that you are extremely mysterious and vicious. With you, Ni sect is likely to be more difficult to deal with than the other 25 sects. If you meet them, you should be careful." Speaking of this, Wen Hun's face turned red. He scratched his head, and said firmly, "Master must be wrong. Sister, you disregard your own safety and go into the mountain to kill ghosts. You are obviously extremely benevolent and righteous. How can you be vicious?" Hearing this, Black Lotus rolled his eyes. The silly boy was grateful for Su Li's kindness of going into the mountain to kill ghosts, but he ignored a big problem. The Grand Elder of a sect disguised her identity and sneaked into another sect. How could her motive be small? Su Li smiled happily, and even said with a hint of relief, "It's great that you can think so." Chapter 526. 34 Chinese Net, in 1 second. Wonderful pop-up window free reading. The road in the Yin Mountain was not complicated. There was only a regular and spacious mountain road leading to the bottom, far into the black dense forest. It was dark and indistinct. Why is the terrain completely different from what is recorded on the map? Wen Hun put down the scroll in his hand, and looked a little confused. Although the map was drawn hundreds of years ago, it was not impossible to find a trace of similarity, right? Did the junior fellow apprentices make a mistake when opening the tactical matrix? "This is not the entrance of the Yin Mountain," Wen Hun said in shock, and immediately looked for the pattern similar to the road in front of him on the map. Su Li smiled indifferently, and said, "The Yin Mountain is not big. Even if it is sent to the wrong place, we can find it." Wen Hun was stunned. Thinking of the horrible strength that Su Li broke out yesterday, he suddenly felt it was very reasonable. Even the Immortal of Ghosts was not her opponent, so the little ghosts and monsters in the Yin Mountain were nothing. When he was about to speak, he suddenly saw Su Li turn her head and stare at his side. Wen Hun's scalp was numb. He moved a few steps away and looked over at the same time. He saw senior sister apprentice Yu, who usually dressed in black, was wearing a dazzling white gauze dress at this moment. She was looking at him with a very strange look. Senior sister apprentice Yu. Wen Hun was in a cold sweat, and patted his chest with a look of lingering fear. "Can you make a sound when you come over? You really scared me." Senior sister apprentice Yu in white did not respond, but just looked at Wen Hun with watery eyes. After a long time, she opened her mouth and mouthed, "Come." The gentle voice blew into Wen Hun's mind like a spring breeze, with an inexplicable breath, so warm. Wen Hun stared at senior sister apprentice Yu in white blankly. He felt a pain in his heart without warning, and sadness surged. He touched his eyes, and saw drops of saltiness on his hands. What happened to me? He had never felt this strange feeling. Was it an attack? He soon became alert, and remembered the master's entrustment. He stared at senior sister apprentice Yu in white, and said, "Sister, do you hear any sound?" "Huh?" Su Li raised her eyebrows. "Did you hear what she said?" Wen Hun nodded solemnly, and slowly pulled out the grey knife from the scabbard. "Master is right. Senior sister apprentice, you can affect my mood this month, but that's all. I will kill her now." Without hesitation, he leaped up and slashed down with his saber. Senior sister apprentice Yu in white disappeared in a panic. With a flash of white light, she appeared a little further away from Wen Hun. Looking at Wen Hun, her eyes were full of sadness. "You're affecting me again." Wen Hun felt a sharp pain in his heart. He staggered a step and inserted the knife into the ground. He covered his chest with one hand and was about to pull out the knife again. "Wait, let's see what she wants to do." Su Li stopped him and looked at the face of senior sister apprentice Yu in white with great interest. She smelled a familiar breath and saw a clue. Wen Hun hesitated for a moment and clenched the blade in his hand, but Master said, "Hehe," Su Li chuckled. She pointed at the wrinkles between Wen Hun's eyebrows and smoothed them out. "I'm here. What are you afraid of? If she really wants to hurt you, I will kill her with a punch." Su Li's words were calm, which calmed Wen Hun down. "Then listen to you, sister." Wen Hun nodded his head hesitantly. Suddenly, he found that the pain in his heart was relieved a lot. He took a deep breath. "She seems to want to take us to a place." Su Li's eyes flickered, and she chuckled, "Let's go and have a look." As Su Li said this, there was a momentary vibration at the end of the mountain road. Although the time was very short, it didn't escape her perception. "It seems that the little pig is very bold." Black Lotus was speechless. He was old and shrewd, and had seen a lot of oddities. Su Li must have seen more than him. The white shadow appeared and disappeared from time to time. Every time it appeared, it moved a distance of several meters. Wen Hun had never seen this kind of movement in any ghost. He was full of vigilance, but his eyes couldn't help falling on the white shadow. Even he didn't know what attracted him. This feeling was too strange. Wen Hun touched his heart, full of confusion. The momentary pain almost killed him, but he didn't hate it or hate it at all. "It's so strange." Su Li kept walking. No matter what strange terrain the white shadow walked on, or integrated into the mountain rocks, she could flatten it with one foot or punch through it with one punch. There was no obstacle. Wen Hun followed her in a trance, and turned a deaf ear to the sound around him. After advancing in this manner for 2 hours, a flat stone wall appeared before the two of them. The stone wall was as smooth as a mirror, as if it had been deliberately polished. Su Li integrated the white shadow into it. When she was about to punch it, she suddenly raised her eyebrows and took back her fist. Then she walked to the stone wall and reached out to touch it gently. Buzz, the ripples spread, and the stone wall gradually became transparent. Then, a stony mountain mansion came into Wen Hun's eyes through a transparent barrier, which was full of astonishment. "You are." Wen Hun walked to the stone wall absent-mindedly, and looked at the tall young man sitting in the mountain mansion. The young man's face was exactly the same as his, and they were 80% similar. Senior sister apprentice Yu in white nestled beside the young man. Her lips squirmed as if she was saying something, but neither Su Li nor Wen Hun could hear it. It seemed that after hearing the words of senior sister apprentice Yu in white, the young man raised his head and looked straight at the outside of the stone wall, but he didn't look at Wen Hun. He said calmly, and his voice came out of the stone wall. "I heard from your mother that Insi didn't expect that we would meet. Hun, you have suffered these years." Wen Hun trembled all over, and looked at the young man in the stone wall incredulously. He fell down along the stone wall, and muttered, "Impossible, I am an orphan. I am." As he said, he suddenly trembled all over. His memory. How could he remember the memory when he was still in infancy? Those were all told by the master. "This stone wall can only be seen from the outside. I heard from your mother that you look like me. She recognized you at the first sight." The young man smiled in a carefree manner, but his words were filled with a strong sense of guilt and helplessness. "I never thought that you would still be alive. I'm sealed here and can't move an inch. I can't do anything, and I'm not qualified to be your father. However, since you're here, are you willing to talk to this incompetent father of yours?" Wen Hun's lips trembled. The sudden truth made him unable to distinguish the truth from the falsehood. His mind went blank, and he couldn't say a word. Su Li wiped the stone wall beside Wen Hun, sat down against it, and chuckled. "It seems that you are the new ghost that He Ju mentioned." Wen Hun trembled, and his nerves were a little numb because of the shock. His nerves were numb from the shock. He muttered, "New ghosts." The young man stopped smiling and looked cold. But the words of senior sister apprentice Yu in white eased his expression quickly. He said, "New ghost. Is that what Insi said? I am Wen Hun's biological father, Wen Yuanqing." "Insi?" Su Li raised her eyebrows. "It's what the ghost under the Hall of the Lord said. According to what you said, that thing is Insi." It seems that you don't know anything. When Yuanqing shook his head. It seemed that he didn't want to talk about it. Since you can bring Hun here, you must have some skills. But if you get involved in this matter, you won't have a good end. Leave the immortal cultivation sect as soon as possible, and even, don't stay in Jojo region anymore. Su Li smiled very brightly, but Black Lotus couldn't help shivering. Someone was going to be unlucky. That little pig really lied to me. Su Li whispered to herself, and touched the cheek of Wen Hun, who was absent-minded. Although she was smiling, her tone was very cold. Wen Yuanqing, your son was raised by He Ju, and he also practiced ghost chapter. Now he has become neither a human nor a ghost, and he doesn't have much life left. In this case, do you think he can still leave the immortal cultivation sect? He Ju. When Wen Yuanqing heard this, his pupils suddenly shrank. He stood up and was about to step out of the stone wall. But Su Li only took one step, and then she heard countless sounds of chains in the mountain wall. Those invisible chains seemed to lock every bone of Wen Yuanqing. When he took a step out, he felt a sharp pain as if his bones were crushed. But Wen Yuanqing remained calm, and continued to pull the chains to walk out of the stone wall. Snap, 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 snap. The chains broke one after another as they couldn't bear the heavy load. But soon, many chains shot out from the stone wall and reconnected to the ports. What followed was an even more terrifying suction. When Yuanqing's body was stretched out, and his head extended far away. My son. When Yuanqing stretched his head out of the stone wall with difficulty. At a glance, he saw a pale and dispirited face leaning against the stone wall, and the hem of clothes faintly emitting red light. Insi, I will kill you. Blue veins stood out all over Wen Yuanqing's body, and he looked ferocious. His eyes shed tears of unwillingness, and the dense chains in the stone wall were tightened at the same time. Bang! When Yuanqing's body exploded into pieces of minced meat falling in the stone house, and then slowly condensed into shape. His face also became as pale as Wen Hun's. Is it worth it just to see your son? Su Li picked up a piece of flesh beside her, looked at it, and said with a hint of emotion, you were really a ghost clan when you were alive. It's interesting to become a ghost clan of ghosts. Wen Yuanqing gasped slightly, and his body suddenly stiffened when he heard this. You. At this moment, a hole suddenly exploded in the originally quiet nothingness, and a familiar face stepped out of the hole. My disciple, don't believe in nonsense. Seeing Wen Hun's distracted look, He Ju looked a little angry. I told you that if you hear you talking, you should kill her. Idiot. You actually believe in the words of ghosts and fall into such a situation. Wen Hun raised his head blankly, and looked at He Ju's face. Somehow, he wanted to vomit. Then he looked back at the man who had just shattered his body for him. For a moment, he couldn't distinguish the truth from the lies, and could only look at Su Li imploringly. What should I do? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.